Good morning, everybody. We can put cameras on for those who are going to be speaking. Now, the time's now 9:30, so good morning, everybody, again. So I'm resuming the hearing into the examination of this local plan. I was just checking whether there's anybody in the meeting that hasn't been in before. I'm not quite sure who Curb 8790 is. So can I just check? I will be going through a list, but can I just check who that is?
Oh, they're from the county council. I'll just change their name. They've just
okay, thank you. That's just helpful. Thank you. Okay, we will be going through a participant list anyway, although I don't think there's anybody here who has not been here before, but I'll go through the list and double check. So same process that we've had previously. I'm going to be going through the Matter 11A, Matter 11C today, doing it as a joint combination because they're interlinked. And obviously it's interlinked with the other infrastructure and transport related issues that we've dealt with under Matter 11 today. We will be having appropriate breaks. I'm anticipating just a morning session. I don't consider us going into the afternoon, but again, let's see how it goes. We do have this afternoon if we need it. So if we do need this afternoon, we'll be breaking for lunch around 1 o'clock. Can I then go through, excuse me, the participant list, please, starting with the council?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Mark Russell and Conrad Moore from Stroud District Council, supported by Alex Horton from Arup, who will be able to answer any questions relating to the IDP. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then I'm just going to go down the list as I ordinarily do. The representatives for Ecotricity Group, please.
Good morning, ma'am. My name is Paul Fong from Morgan Elliott Planning, representing Ecotricity, and with me today I have Chris Long from Ridge.
Morning, Inspector. Morning, everyone.
Morning. The representatives for Crest Nicholson, please.
Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, everybody. Tony Clements from Nexus Planning. I'm here on my own this morning.
Okay, thank you. Gloucestershire County Council, please.
Morning, ma'am. Nathan Drover, Highways Development Manager, Gloucestershire County Council. I've got Lee Holman, Claudia Curry, and Louisa Semtaywood.
Thank you. The representative for Redrow Homes, please.
Morning, Emma Fortune from Carney Sweeney, representing Redrow Homes and specifically strategic site G1 land south of Hardwick.
Thank you. Winslow Action Group.
Yeah, Andy Davis, Winslow Action Group.
Thank you. Representative for Robert Hitchens.
Morning, ma'am. Sarah Hamilton-Foy from Pegasus Group, and on my own today. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative for Persimmon Home, Severn Valley.
Good morning, James Millard of Blue Fox Planning, representing Persimmon Homes, specifically in respect of PS24 and PS38.
Thank you. Do we have the National Trust? They're down on the participant list, but I don't think they're present.
Yes, I'm here.
Ah, excellent. Sorry, I didn't see you there. Right. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Mark Funnell, Planning Advisor with the National Trust.
Thank you. Tritax Symmetry, please.
Picture come up? Hello?
Hello?
Can you not hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. Yeah, it's Tim Partridge from Tritax Symmetry. My video stream hasn't come up on my screen. That was all.
That's fine. Does your hand up function still work? Would you like to just test that? Because if it doesn't, you're going to, if you need to speak, you're going to have to actually interrupt. It does, right. No, that's fine then. That's absolutely fine.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The representative for Taylor Wimpey, please.
Morning, ma'am. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Good. Yes, Conor Flanagan from Black Box Planning.
Thank you. L&Q Estates, please.
Morning, ma'am. Yes, Neil Brandt for Neil Brandt Consultant on behalf of L&Q Estates with regards to site G2 at Wadham.
Thank you. I think that's everybody. Is there anybody else present who hasn't introduced themselves? I don't think there is, but please shout if there is. Well, not shout, but introduce yourself. Right. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do first of all is start. We're going to go specifically into core policy CP6. We're going to make a start there before we get into some more of the nitty-gritty policies on other infrastructure. Now, as part of discussing CP6, I don't have an issue with dealing with any aspects related to transport. As I said, I'm not, in saying that, I don't want any repetition of the discussions that we've had, but in relation to policy CP6, which is about delivery of all infrastructure, and excuse me, the developer developer contributions that are proposed to be brought forward as part of the plan, then I am content for any references to transport required infrastructure in the IDP and other various evidence documents be brought forward, specifically in relation to CP6 and how it's to be delivered. Now, having said that, we are missing an important piece of evidence, which is obviously the statement which myself and my colleague are waiting for from, and this is this statement, the joint statements that's being produced with the council and National Highways, and well, others are included in that as well, but it's specifically understanding that statement on the back of our part 1 11B matter 11B discussions that we had previously. Now, just so again I don't forget this later on, could I just have an understanding of where we are with that note? I know, Mr. Russell, you did give me an update, but we desperately need that information. So is there a particular, I mean, ideally, I would like it in the next 2 weeks. So is there a reason why that would not be possible? Is there a resourcing issue or a complication that I'm not aware of as to why we couldn't get that statement as soon as?
No, the statement is, as I said the other day, I think it's on its 3rd iteration. We had a meeting on the 2nd of May with the parties. So there are some tweaks that need to be made to respond to the particular issues that we discussed at that meeting. Our consultant, Chris Carter from ACOM, is working on that today. So subject to, obviously we will circulate it around all the parties, and on the assumption that no new issues will be raised, we should be able to send that to you early next week.
That would be great. If I can put a deadline on of, just bear with me. I mean, if we can have it next week, that would be fantastic. But if there is an issue, if we could have it by the 18th of May as an absolute even if it's got to the point whereas there is still agreements, and there may well be agreements in there, but there may still be disagreements. So it's a bit like an updated statement of common ground, I suppose. But it's a bit, I don't want it to be a statement of common ground. I want it to really set out what the next steps are in actually resolving the issues that have been highlighted in terms of the strategic road network, because that's quite critical in terms of further discussions. It would have been helpful to have had it for today's discussion, but obviously we recognise that that hasn't been possible, and we do recognise that obviously work has been ongoing on that. So yeah, that's very appreciative that some progress has been made, and as soon as that has been made available and myself and my colleague have looked at that, we will make it available for others to have a look at that as well. And as I said yesterday, whether we allow further comments on it, that will be something that we will decide, because it depends on our next steps in terms of the examination. So just to let everybody be aware of that. But in whichever whatever we as the inspectors decide to do, it will be made public. So don't worry yourselves about that. Mr. Partridge, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, ma'am. It was just a question. You said in your introduction there that it was a joint statement, and Mr. Russell was talking about other parties. Is it a joint statement, and who are the other parties? Because originally it was I understood it was just a statement from Mr. Russell.
No, this was on the back of the focused discussion.
Yes, no, I was aware of that, but I thought it was just Mr. Russell producing a position statement. So I was just wondering who the joint statement is and who the other parties were that are involved in this statement.
Mr. Russell, do you want to just clarify?
Yes, so obviously our consultant has drafted the document, and we welcome comments from National Highways, from Gloucestershire County Council and from South Gloucestershire Council. We will also be sharing it with in particular Gloucester City Council in terms of neighbouring district authorities. But my understanding was that we would seek agreement on that statement. If we were not able to seek agreement, the council would submit it, and we would identify any areas where the other parties were in disagreement. Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Mr. Partridge?
It does, but it doesn't sound like a joint statement. It sounds like a statement from Stroud and comments from other parties.
Well, well, let's not get into semantics. It was a statement. What is important is myself and my colleague need this information pronto. We need this information quickly. It's about a next step statement, and it was to be produced by the council, because this is the council's plan, with the involvement of others. Now, I've used the word joint, as in it's a signed up, everybody else is in agreement, etc. That's not what I meant. So my apologies if my use of the term joint statement is wrong, but it is jointly being discussed in partnership with others to try and come to some form of agreement where possible, and where there is disagreement still in terms of next steps. So as Mr. Russell has said, it's about just setting that out. So like a statement of common ground, that's produced jointly, but it sets out areas of agreement and disagreement. So that's still a joint statement. So I'd rather not get into the semantics of whether it's a joint statement or not.
No, sorry, ma'am. I fully appreciate that. But at that initial discussion, one of the main issues was that there were several parties involved, and there wasn't agreement between the key parties that would enable the junctions to come forward. So it was just to try and understand.
Well, that's why I'm hoping
Yeah.
I'm hoping that the statement will provide some clarity. If it doesn't, then we're back to square one, Mr. Partridge, aren't we?
Fine,
So
yeah.
so hopefully once we get the statement, we will understand what progress has been made, if any, and what the next steps are. So I'm hoping that that will provide myself and my colleague with that bit more clarity, and hopefully others like yourself, Mr. Partridge, it'll provide greater clarity for others who are interested in development in the borough, in the district. Sorry.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. So CP6. So having sort of done that sort of introductory element, I think I'd like to start by just asking the council to explain your approach regarding CP6 and what CP6 is trying to achieve. And why I talk about an approach, and we have had a discussion and things have moved on slightly, in that now specific reference to infrastructure is going to be made within site allocations, because currently that is not always the case. So on the back of that, because I've got a lot of representations who have said, well, the policy doesn't reference specific infrastructure, it doesn't set out costs, it doesn't set out timescales. Now, obviously, we've got the IDP, and the council's response is that the IDP lists everything. And since the Regulation 19 consultation and the representations that were from that consultation, then obviously documents have been updated by the council since that. So what I want to try and understand is those that are present in this meeting today, in this session today, whether your position has changed on the back of the additional evidence that the council has produced. So whether you still feel, no, this is still an issue. And okay, yes, the infrastructure may, a specific infrastructure may be going into the site allocation policies, but we're still concerned that this policy is not sound. So on the back of that, if we can just have that sort of discussion, I'm going to start with the council and just so the council can explain their approach to this policy, because it is very generic, the policy. It's sort of broad intentions, but is that an appropriate approach from the council? Because they are now going to put some specific infrastructure requirements, particularly in the larger strategic allocations, let's put it that way, will be going into those site allocations. So I would like to understand and hear from other participants in the room whether that still doesn't make this an effective policy or not. So I'll start with council, please. Could you just explain your approach that you've taken and whether anything has changed from what's happened with the additional evidence, and you now considering putting in, or are putting in, infrastructure into the site allocation policies?
Thank you. Yes. So firstly, it's a strategic policy, I would argue, rather than a generic policy. It's policy CP6. It's within the core policies in the development strategy section of the plan, and it sets out, it seeks to do two things. One is to explain how the council with its partners will facilitate infrastructure required to support the development strategy, and it does that by setting out a series of actions, including development and regular review of the infrastructure delivery plan, securing contributions, delivery of a community infrastructure levy, and negotiating appropriate planning obligations. So that's the first half of the policy. The second half of the policy is around developer contributions and sets out a requirement for developers who have an impact on the existing standard of infrastructure to make up the required provision relating to their development. And it seeks to obviously do that two ways. One is through on-site delivery, and the second is through contributions. There is a section setting out the types of contributions, and final point is really to have regard to viability, which is clearly and site-specific circumstances, which are key factors when considering infrastructure. Now, the policy is, as I said, a strategic policy. Both an MPPF and the various planning practice guidance notes, which have been quoted by other parties, none of those documents state that the requirements for infrastructure need to be set out in a single policy. I won't labour the point, but the MPPF talks about plans should set out contributions expected from development. I won't quote the very long reference in the planning practice guidance, but there's a reference to policies for planning obligations in the plural. There's also a reference to plans should be informed by evidence of infrastructure and affordable housing need. So nowhere does it say in either the MPPF or guidance that infrastructure policy, there needs to be a single infrastructure policy which sets out within that policy all of the standards and requirements that are required in a plan. As I've said a number of times during this examination, you need to read the plan as a whole. This establishes the principle, and then a series of detailed policy requirements are, for example, set out in policy CP9 for affordable housing, DHC7 for open space and sports facilities, EI12 transport infrastructure, parking standards, and DES2 green infrastructure. And there are other policies clearly within the plan that will be relevant. Strategic site allocation policies set out the detailed requirements per the strategic sites and also link back to the infrastructure delivery plan itself. Now, the policy CP6 refers to the infrastructure delivery plan. That is also referred in the supporting text, which clearly states it identifies the infrastructure the local service providers and the district councils have established as key to delivering growth in the district, and updated will need to be reviewed and updated as circumstances change. So that's the broad framework for the plan. I had a look at recently adopted local plans elsewhere in the country. Obviously, they vary, but there are very few, one or two, that set out in a single policy all of the detailed infrastructure proposals, standards, etc. I believe that immediately dates a plan. Infrastructure does change over time and requirements, and that you need that flexibility at the development management stage, and that's why the infrastructure delivery plan will be reviewed and updated. Now, I think the final point I wanted to make was that there is and this is, I guess, a concession hoping to perhaps short circuit any significant debate about the issue. But I think it is fair comment that there is no specific reference in CP6 to other policies in the plan and the requirement on developers to look at those other policies. So if it would assist, if I can propose an amendment modification, which I'm happy to discuss. Now this change that I'm about to reference is actually in a recently adopted local plan. If you obviously require the details, we can put that extract into the examination library. So the change that I would propose in the paragraph beginning where implementation of a development would create a need to provide additional or improved infrastructure and amenities would have an impact on the existing standard of infrastructure provided or would exacerbate an existing deficiency in their provision. The developer will be expected to make up that provision for those local communities affected. That's the current wording. I am suggested at the end of that sentence adding either alone or cumulatively with other developers as set out in the infrastructure delivery plan and other policies in this plan. So what that does is explicitly link the requirement for infrastructure provision from new developers to be in accordance with the infrastructure delivery plan and other policies in this plan. As I said, that's from a direct quote from a recently adopted local plan in 2022. Apologies to them if it's seen as plagiarism, but
plagiarism.
dare I say, but I think I'm sure we all agree that we can all learn off each other, and that to me is their policy, by the way. And again, I can put it is it doesn't include any details on any infrastructure standards or provision, and it doesn't include a list of types of infrastructure. It's simply a strategic policy which links infrastructure to the requirement for developer contributions. And as I said, it links back to other policies in their plan and to the IDP, which incidentally, in that plan, there's also reference to the need for the infrastructure delivery plan to be updated. So I think that picks up another point that of contention with some participants. Obviously, you know, we can go through those objections, but I hope that's of assistance to you, Inspector, and other participants in clarifying the purpose and effectiveness of this policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. And just to make it clear, a developer contribution policy doesn't have to include the infrastructure, as in provide a list. What I'm looking at, and I have dealt with local plans that have broad or high top level strategic policies dealing with developer contributions. The difference in those cases was that the strategic infrastructure in particular was listed elsewhere in other policies. So that, I suppose, that's what I need to consider as to whether it's clear as to where, and I'm particularly talking about strategic, the absolute, I don't like using the term showstoppers, but it's the showstopper infrastructure. It's absolutely critical to bring forward the growth of the plan. It's making sure that that's clearly set out, because that's unlikely to change in the lifetime of the plan. Other aspects, I hear what you're saying about the IDP need to be updated, things change, government policy changes, infrastructure requirements may change, societal changes happen, etc. So there is there is an element of flux with an IDP. Fully understand that needs to be kept up to date. I suppose what there needs to be is there for decision makers and for developers and for local residents, for anybody who's interested in the plan, just needs to ensure that they understand exactly what infrastructure is proposed to be delivered and how that's going to be delivered and whether it's viable, and whether the plan sufficiently sets that out so that it meets the tests of soundness in relation to effectiveness, and whether the plan can then the growth that's set out in the plan can come forward in an appropriate way. So fully hear what you're saying in relation to it doesn't have to list the requirements in the policy. I'm not saying that they do need to list the requirements in the policy. It's whether they are elsewhere in the plan. So within reason. Mr. Russell?
Yes, just on that then, obviously, as we referred to it yesterday, we're in the process of agreeing modifications to EI 12, which will include references to improvements to junctions 12, 13 and 14. So in my terms, layman terms, in terms of transport, that to me is identifying the key strategic transport improvements that are required to the strategic road network. Other strategic infrastructure requirements are, unless others can identify otherwise, are identified in the strategic site allocation. So, for example, the secondary school at Sharpness New Settlement being a strategic infrastructure provision. I won't go into any of the others. We can no doubt have a debate as to what's strategic and what's local, but I believe that the combination of the more detailed development management policies in terms of standards and requirements, which will address any infrastructure that isn't identified at this stage, which might come forward through any windfall development, together with the strategic allocations, which set out in quite a lot of detail all of the criteria in terms of what is required to be put in place to provide for those developments. I think in combination, those do adequately address the points you're making. Thank you.
We will go through the infrastructure requirements for each site as we go through it, obviously. I suppose one of the issues, without trying to repeat what was said previously about the strategic road network issues, is the differences that, or the issues that have been raised around the costings for that, and whether the deliverability of those upgrades to the motorway junctions. And I don't want a discussion about this now, but I'm just raising it because it's to try and make a point, is that obviously the costings are wrong in the evidence, or grossly underestimated, and then that will come up as an issue in relation to viability, which we will come on to later on as we go through the examination process, which is why I need to understand this, which is why this statement is important in terms of next steps and where the council and National Highways in particular sit on that particular on this particular issue. And the implications of that, the viability of bringing forward the growth that's planned within the plan itself. Mr. Partridge, you've got your hand up. Mr. Partridge.
Sorry, ma'am, I didn't take it down from earlier. Apologies.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Okay. Does the policy, I'm aware, obviously, through the evidence and what's set out actually in the plan, that the council has a SIL. Does the policy make it clear as to what infrastructure will be provided through SIL and what will be provided through Section 106 planning agreements? And is that necessary to make that clear? And if so, how could that be made clear or clearer? Just from the council's perspective first, and I'm going to open up to have a bit of a discussion.
So the council's view is that there's a specific identification of any split between SIL and Section 106 is something that does change over time. SIL is required to be reviewed regularly, and we don't think that would provide clarity to the plan for those who read it in the future. The current situation is set out in our infrastructure funding statement, which is referenced in paragraph 2.9.32, and it actually explicitly states the council sets out in its annual infrastructure funding statement how developer contributions have been used and will be used to provide infrastructure within the district. Now, I think the key point for us is flexibility. I know we're not dealing with viability today, but just to put a marker down, that the viability appraisal has considered both Section 106 costs and SIL costs in the appraisal that's set out, and our viability consultant will be very happy to take you through that as part of matter 12. But we certainly don't think that that needs to be explicit in the strategic policy in the local plan. That's probably all I need to say at the moment, and obviously happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Can I sort of open up the meeting to others who are participating, having heard what you've heard and the additional evidence that the council has provided and the changes that are suggested as potential modifications, and looking particularly at policy CP6 and how that is read. Are there any remaining issues in relation to its effectiveness or the effectiveness of bringing forward infrastructure within the plan period? Ms. Hamilton-Foyne, please.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a point that we made in our representations at the Reg 19 plan. We were concerned about the reference to the IDP in the text and the reliance upon that being changing, and how, if that does change, could it undermine the delivery of the plan? I suppose it depends on the scope of the changes, but if there are any fundamental changes, then it would need to be a review, really.
But it's not unusual for IDP. IDPs are updated on a regular basis. That's not unusual. No, so from your perspective, what in particular is your concern with that approach? It's
the implications of that being updated, the degree of the change, perhaps, that would affect the viability of the policies. I mean, we don't know what changes would be brought about through an update in the IDP.
So what would be your suggestion for ensuring that the policy is sound on that basis?
I think the reliance on the IDP is a concern, but that maybe the policies and the plan need to be more specific. Like we just said, and Mark Russell's agree that the site allocation policies will have more detail in about the requirements. So any developer would be more certain of what is required to be delivered as part of that site. I think it's having certainty of what is requested and what contributions would be required.
So at the moment, Mr. Russell has just said that the IDP, the requirements that have been set out, including the updated, because obviously the viability assessment was updated as well as the IDP post submission. So Mr. Russell has just said that those are viable at a high level viability assessment, obviously not getting down to site-specific viability assessments, which are a different process. Well, not different process, but just becomes more detailed. Yeah. Yes, absolutely, later process. Yeah. Taking on board what's included in that, are there such significant changes that could happen?
I think
that could change things so dramatically, and even if it did, Mr. Russell has said, well, there's a viability clause in the policy anyway. So if it's a viability issue, then the developer can bring that forward and do a viability assessment and make that clear. So is there? So where's the antagonism? I'm just trying to understand from your perspective.
I think when we made representations, we talked about the county council and the education contributions. I don't want to go into that in detail now because it could be a long debate on that. But that is a case in point where things have changed, and lots of people are not happy with the county council's approach and the implications of that. And I think maybe, as you say, we just have to test that through viability at the end of the day, when we put an application in.
Is that a sound approach?
Wow, that's the question, isn't it? Is it sound? Because I think the concern is the IDP almost becomes like an SPD by default, and you shouldn't really rely on an SPD in that sense.
Not in terms of setting policy, no, but obviously an SDP can provide further guidance. Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's just a question of the reliance and the degree of changes, and I suppose we won't know about that change until that IDP is reviewed on an annual basis. And it's, I suppose we as the part of the development industry would have to keep abreast of those changes and be aware of that in terms of putting applications forward. And at the end of the day, then if it is an issue, as you say, we'd have to test it through a viability appraisal.
Thank you, Hamilton Full. May come back on a couple of points, but Mr. Russell, you've got. Did you just want to respond on the points that have been made, and then I've got a couple of other hands that are up as well.
Yes, it was just a couple of points really. One is around obviously the education, and we can talk more about that if you require. But the position the council is in is that we have interim standards for education at the moment, so that they're still in flux, and we cannot essentially hold the plan to ransom on the basis that the methodology that the county council is reviewing is going to somehow we can't finalize the plan until that's been established. We have and I'm sure Alex will come in a minute. We've assessed the plan and its requirements on the basis of the most up-to-date information that we have, and I will as I think Sarah Hampton-Foyne has acknowledged, there is still the mechanism of a viability assessment at the development management stage, and I'll sort of point you to the planning practice guidance, where it talks about the circumstances under which a site-specific viability assessment are appropriate, and it says such circumstances could include where further information on infrastructure or site costs is required. So I think the mechanism, it's an established mechanism. It's established by government guidance. We've provided the most up-to-date information we have, and assessed the plan on that basis. And I think really we've gone as far as we can to provide certainty over that particular element of infrastructure provision. Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose what myself and my colleague need to ensure is that the infrastructure required to bring forward the development is within the plan and is viable. That's our focus. If something is in flux, and obviously I've got the IDP addendum in front of me, and where it sets out the interim status of the education contributions, etc. And I obviously hear what you're saying in relation to this is it's a county council matter, because obviously they deal with that, and the situation is what it is at the moment, and obviously will where appropriate be challenged through site-specific viability assessments. So I don't want to focus necessarily just on education, but what we're concerned about is whether the infrastructure and the contributions that will come forward from that from the development that's proposed as part of the planned growth is viable and is deliverable. Now, obviously, we're not dealing with viability today. That's going to be a much longer conversation when we get to that point, that discussion. So that's what I want to try and focus on, this issue of the education and what the decision about what education provision is required. That is something that can be tested through a viability assessment either way. The provision of other forms of infrastructure, less so, because it's so, and I'm not saying that education isn't important, absolutely. Any development that comes forward needs to provide for the potential pupils, students that will come forward from that development, absolutely. But that can be challenged to a certain extent, depending upon the formula that's used or the way that the amount of contribution is assessed. Less so in relation to strategic transport, for instance. So I'm just trying to ensure that, yes, there may be specific site issues, and I don't want to differentiate between different forms of infrastructure because they're all absolutely very important: community infrastructure, education, healthcare, the provision of green infrastructure, open spaces, all exceptionally important for the development in terms of sites, but also for ensuring that communities are developed in the right way. I've got 3 hands up, so I'm just going to go along. Excuse me a minute. So I'm just going to go along the participants that I've got set up. So I'm going to start with Mr. Fong, please. Then I'll go to Ms. Fortune, and then Mr. Horton. Is it Horton? Have I got that right? Thank you. Mr. Fong, please.
Morning, Ma'am. I'm slightly sitting on the fence here. I am more reassured by Mr. Russell's addendum that might come forward. But on behalf of Ecotricity, the thing that we are worried about is being hostage to the highways improvements, in particular Junction 13, and we haven't got that note yet, and we don't know what those costs are. You and I will have a discussion later on PS20, but you will know our objection to criterion 20 on PS20, which says any associated infrastructure in the locality. Now, given our position right next to Junction 13, it may end up myself and Miss Hamilton Foyne paying for all those junction improvements. And that's why I'm slightly more comforted by what Mr. Ross has said this morning, but I am obviously wanting to see the note that emerges from this before I sit back in my armchair and smoke a pipe. But you can probably see where I am, and it would have been helpful if I had that note now rather than later.
I agree, but we are where we are with the note. I did give a deadline of the end of April for all information, but unfortunately, Mr. Russell did explain that it wasn't possible, but at least the note has been produced, so at least some progress has been made, which is good. And Mr. Russell has intimated that it should be available next week, hopefully. There will then be an opportunity to either comment on that note if myself and my colleague consider that's appropriate, or to discuss matters later in other sessions as well. So it's going to be something that we need to consider further. So, okay, thank you. Ms. Fortune?
Thanks, Ma'am. Just going back to education and just a point of consistency that we just want to raise. Sorry, I need to talk about site specific just to evidence sort of like the point that I want to make, if that's
given
okay.
it, use it as an example, but
yes,
we're not going to be having a discussion about
the
site.
No,
yes.
It's just an example.
That's fine.
We've identified that the IDP doesn't fully accord with the policy wording of the strategic policies. So specifically in relation to strategic site G1, so land south of Hardwick. So section 3.8.3 of the IDP, which deals with education specifically in relation to Hardwick, outlines that a secondary school will be sought on either Hardwick or Wadden, with contributions towards the primary schools and other education set out. This is, however, contrary to criterion 2 of policy G1 in the local plan and the statement of common ground that we've agreed with the council, which sets out that a primary school will be provided on the site, which obviously the IDP doesn't outline, and then contributions towards the secondary school will be, and further education will be set out. So we're just concerned that the IDP at the moment, as currently worded, is at odds with the wording of the strategic site allocation for G1. And whilst the IDP obviously can be reviewed and revised, we would hope that it would obviously be off on the right foot, you know, in terms of the adoption of the local plan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Has anything from your perspective then, has anything, because obviously this update has been since the plan was produced and has been since the submission. So has there been a discussion with the council or the education authority about this provision of secondary school education?
It's always been our understanding that the secondary school would be placed at Wadden, and you know, policy G2 makes an allowance, specifically outlines that within the local plan. We've never been given the impression, nor have we ever made an allowance for a secondary school to be at Hardwick. It's only been the primary provision, and so we've moved forward on that basis. I can see Mark nodding at me, so I think that's the council's understanding as well.
Okay, okay.
Thank you.
Ma'am, if I may, I might be able to assist with that just a little further.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yeah, so there has been, I'll not speak for the County Council Education Authority or the DFE, but they did undertake work in terms of looking for a new secondary school site to deal with the needs of Gloucester going forward. And the Wadden site was identified as their preferred site. From that. So that is...
Oh, I'm losing you. I can't hear you.
Oh, you got me? Hello? Yeah, I'm back.
I can hear you now. So I lost the latter end of what you were saying.
So just to repeat, the County Council Education Authority and the Department for Education did some work as this secondary school site was being looked at in terms of the future needs of Gloucester, and they confirmed that Wadden was their preferred site. The DFE were looking at it in terms of free school funding. So it was confirmed as a site going forward. The way the funding pools work, because the school wasn't coming online in time for the current funding cycle, it's been moved to the next cycle. But in terms of the overall sites, as you are, the G2 site was identified by county and DFE as their preferred location. So that's just to confirm what Ms. Fortune was saying.
Thank you. That's been helpful. Obviously, I'm sure we'll come to this when we start to discuss the specific site elements as well. Thank you for that. I'm going to bring in Mr. Horton and then I'll come to Mr. Clements.
Thank you, Ma'am. Just in response to Ms. Fortune's comments, I think if you see table 23 of the IDP addendum, that does set out the requirements for South of Hardwick in relation to education, and in relation to secondary schools, it says that the contribution to a secondary school on Wadden or a new on-site secondary school. So I think that indicates that the first preference, as suggested by Mr. Flanagan and Mr. Fortune, is that it would be more likely to be on Wadden. And that was based on the discussions that we had in consultation with GCC Education. So apologies, I didn't quite catch the reference, Ms. Fortune, but if that's incorrect, we can obviously update that. But table 23 accords with both the policies and the positions set out by Ms. Fortune and Mr. Flanagan. And then just coming back to the previous points in relation to the use of standards and benchmarks in the IDP, I think it's easy to get hung up on some of the standards that have been put forward in the IDP. They are obviously a starting point and a benchmarking exercise to give an indication of what some costs might be. And obviously everybody that's on the call is aware that there is a review of the standards ongoing at the moment with GCC Education. We have consulted with them just before these hearings in the last couple of weeks, and they've advised that the pupil product ratios are going to be reviewed, or they're in process of being reviewed at the moment, and there's likely to be an update later on this year. So obviously that won't be in time for this examination. However, I think the policies, the site allocation policies, are really clear, as are the tables at the end of the IDP addendum, as to what the specific site requirements are in terms of either providing schools on sites for strategic allocations or providing contributions to them. So again, I think the lack of progress made by the education in terms of the benchmark standards doesn't sort of confuse matters, because we have the clarity within the policy wording and in the tables in the IDP as well in terms of site-specific requirements.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to Ms. Fortune, because I know you've got just, I presume is to come back on what's just been said in relation to G1.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, thank you, Ma'am. Yeah, just to clarify for Mr. Horton that it was section 3.8.3 of the IDP. If that text could be updated to tally with table 23, then I think that that gives us the certainty of what's being asked for, and then we'll accord with strategic site policy G1.
Yeah, that's not a problem. I think at the moment it says it's either the Whaddon or the Hardwick sites. I think that was just on the basis that there was a bit of uncertainty at the time, but as I say, the tables are a bit clearer, so we can update that to reflect that. That's not a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Clements, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. Sorry, unmuted now. It was just a general point picking up on, I think, two of the comments. I think you mentioned that the issue really at hand here is are there any showstoppers? And I think that to us seems to be the critical issue. And I would say our principal concern in respect of CRESS interests relates obviously to the strategic highway network, which we're not in a position to bottom out today. But it seems to me that when the plan is operational and we're using the plan, the policies, the strategic policies will be the starting point for determining infrastructure requirements relating to each of the sites and the deliverability of them in that context. So I think Mr. Russell's agreement that the policies will be made more specific to include what the strategic infrastructure requirements are for each is the right approach, and we would support that. I think the IDP, as we would see it, is a document that, yes, it does adapt and respond, but its purpose is to be prepared to inform the strategic allocations on which the plan rests. And so once again, that would be the first port of call, I think, for interpreting how a particular allocation is going to be delivered. So those key items of strategic infrastructure need to be set out in the policy, in our view. And then CP6 almost operates as a sort of daughter policy to those strategic allocating policies, which provides provisions as they do in part 2 relating to viability. So I think on the basis of the discussions we're having, we are comforted that if the policies are made more specific and the specific infrastructure requirements relating to each allocation are set out in the policy, that ought to give developers, the public, everybody a degree of certainty about what will be provided with each site coming forward. And then there will be infrastructure requirements that change over time, and provided that there are viability caveats in the policy, then they ought to be sufficiently robust. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the site allocate? So are you saying that the I'm just trying to understand exactly where you're coming from your perspective. You said that you support the council's approach in relation to making the site allocation policies much more specific in relation to what infrastructure is required, particularly the strategic infrastructure, what needs to come forward. So as long as those are placed into the allocation policy, are you talking specifically about the allocation policies themselves?
Yes, ma'am. I think it's taking a step back, it would be those infrastructure items or those provisions within the policy which underpin those policies, which out of necessity need to be made or they need to be provided for, and perhaps go to the heart of why a decision was made to allocate a particular site. Now, those might be transport related, or they might be relating to the provision of a main strategic piece of infrastructure, such as a secondary school. And those requirements might have informed the spatial approach to allocating particular sites. So I think that's the point, that those infrastructure items that underpin the policy decisions that have been taken spatially need to be captured within the policy. And there will be a variety of, let me say, sort of non-strategic infrastructure items that might reasonably be required, which might change from time to time in terms of primary school capacities, for example, which wouldn't necessarily go to the heart of a site being allocated particularly.
Can I just get the council's response on that before I move on? I know Mr. Drover's got his hand up.
I think Mr. Clements talks a lot of sense. I think that's essentially a key requirement of the plan. It does go, key strategic infrastructure goes to the heart of why particular sites can secure the strategic infrastructure needed to deliver the level of growth required. So I don't have an issue with that at all. As we say, we'll go into the detailed criteria for each site allocation, and we can look at that in more detail. I obviously, just to reiterate the point, I referenced the amendments to the transport policies yesterday in terms of the strategic transport infrastructure, just to confirm we will also be including specific requirements relating to junctions 12, 13 and 14 in the strategic allocation policies. So in the schedule that we will be sending you, Inspector, which have been agreed with National Highways, and that will set out not just EI12, and it will also set out specific changes to the strategic sites in relation to that highway infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. That's really helpful. And my apologies, but I've not looked. I know that we asked, I think it was in our first week, for you to set out which policies you consider are strategic and which are non-strategic. And my apologies for not having the capacity to have looked at your notes on that. I'm assuming that forms part of the information that has been sent to us this week, but I've not opened the information that's been available. The changes that you set out, because I suppose I just need, you don't have to go through all of this now, but I just need to understand that strategic infrastructure needs to be in a strategic policy. So can you just confirm that, yes, that is the case, and I will look at that next week then? Is that what's set out in your... The transport, the strategic transport infrastructure set out in the IDP in relations to junctions 12, 13 and 14 will be specifically referenced in those strategic site policies that relate to the delivery of that infrastructure. So yes, and they are strategic policies in the terms of
yes.
the framework.
Oh, absolutely. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
In terms
that's
of
what I mean. That's what I mean between strategic and non-strategic.
Yes. Sorry, I understand what you're saying. Yes,
okay.
All of the strategic sites will be identified as strategic policies.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, I know they're called strategic in the plan, but it's whether they meet their strategic in terms of what the framework is asking. So thank you for clarifying that. That's really helpful. Mr. Drover, please.
Thank you, ma'am. I think Mr. Russell's probably dealt with it, but it was about the showstoppers and the what's fundamental to make the developments acceptable. And I know we're going to deal with 12, 13 and 14. We're coming back on Sharpness. We've got Wadden. So if you look at Wislow and the footbridge, for example, so that's certainly not strategic infrastructure. It's quite an expensive bit of kit. That's absolutely fundamental to make development north of the M5 acceptable. And I was sort of reasonably relaxed because the policy says will be in place at the right time in the first sentence. But I was just wondering whether it should equally, whether if you're reviewing it, if Mr. Russell's reviewing it, whether it should make some provision for when development shouldn't come forward for those showstoppers. So I was little bit worried because, you know, if it being in the place at the right time, okay, we get 100 units north of the M5 at Wislow, 150, and then they find it's not viable for whatever reason, we would end up with an island of growth north of the M5, which is fairly unsustainable. So does it need to be reviewed to deal with the when a bit more robustly on those showstoppers? That was one. And the other point was, if you go down past points 1, 2, 3, 4, and the paragraph below that, it says where implementation of the development would, and then I think there's 3 points. It would create the need to provide additional improved infrastructure and amenities. That's 1. Would have an impact on the existing standard of infrastructure provided. That's 2. Or would exacerbate an existing deficiency in their provision. That's 3. So again, going to the Wislow example, it would create the need for an additional bridge over the M5. And then I think we heard yesterday from, I forget the gentleman's name, about the rail bridge over the M5 being narrow. Sorry, the road over rail on the to the west being narrow, and that would be an existing deficiency. So tick those boxes. But the next line says the developer will be expected to make up the provision for those local communities affected, and that's the sentence that I was just wrestling with a little bit. So those bits of infrastructure aren't they have no direct impact on the local communities. They're necessary only to make the development acceptable. So in the same way that
so whether it meets the planning obligations tests.
Yes, yeah. So yeah. I think that's so. Anyway, if Mr. Russell's rewording it anyway, maybe we can look at that as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Drover. Mr. Russell. Well, in the context of Wislow, I think we discussed that the other day, that we would be making it clear that the bridge would be a requirement, policy requirement. We could reference, you know, at an early phase or similar wording, just to ensure that there is an early trigger in the policy. So I mean, that's a matter of detail and site specifics, but the more general point was, well, I don't think, to be fair, in our policy we need to set out the planning obligation tests that are set out under national policy. I mean, that's, you know, that's taken as read. So if it's necessary, if the infrastructure is necessary, and if it's identified in the Sustainable Transport Strategy and the IDP, then I think we've got all the guarantees set out already. I really don't think we need to, you know, the plan, the policies in the plan are essentially there to identify the particular local circumstances where national policies apply. We've referenced local communities, so that's clearly an issue we wanted to get into our policy. But whether infrastructure satisfies the broader tests, that's set out in national policy, and that's not. We don't need to duplicate that in our local plan policy.
Yeah, ma'am, I don't disagree with Mr. Russell. I just think some of this infrastructure, the absence of some of this infrastructure, is not affecting local communities. You know, it has absolutely nothing to do with it. So the bridge over the M5 has nothing to do with local communities. So why would the developer be expected to make up a provision for those local communities? Because they're not affected. So it's just the policy wording.
So is it the wording? Yeah. So what would you suggest in terms of the wording? Have you got a suggestion?
No, I haven't, because it just sprung into my mind. But the developer will be expected to make up that provision where local communities are affected or where infrastructure is essential to make the development acceptable, or is necessary to make the development acceptable. But it's not. There'll be a lot of infrastructure on this shopping list that will not affect local communities, but is still required to make the development acceptable. So the only circumstances in which CP6, where the developer would be expected to make up provision, That's what the wording is where local communities are affected. And I think that's just probably the weakness in the wording. Whether it's any of those 3 points, whether it's additional improved infrastructure, impact on existing standards of infrastructure, or exacerbating existing deficiencies, a lot of those lists, so, sharpness rail has absolutely nothing to do. That infrastructure won't impact. The absence of that infrastructure won't impact a lot of communities affected by the development. But anyway, I think it just needs a bit of a rewording to deal with those bits of infrastructure, the absence of which affects local communities, and those bits of infrastructure which have, they're completely incidental to local communities, but are still necessary to make the development acceptable. So it's just that particular sentence, I think. But if Mr. Russell's looking at it again, perhaps he can just review it.
Thank you, Mr. Drover. Are there, I'm just going to look at my notes, are there any other queries or questions in relation to the policy wording in particular now of CP6? Taking into mind the discussion that we've had this morning and also on previous sessions where specific strategic infrastructure will be, or the council is going to check and make sure that those requirements are set out within individual site allocation policies, and then we can discuss those as we start to go through matter 6 in more detail for specific sites. Are there any other queries in relation to the wording of this policy and its deliverability and effectiveness? Mr. Millard, please.
Yeah, good morning. It's really just to reiterate with those suggested changes and the more detail on the infrastructure related to specific policies within the plan, we're far more comfortable with the effectiveness of CP6. I think CP6 then provides the framework and the detail very much focused on the site-specific allocation. So we're more comfortable with CP6 with those suggested changes than perhaps we were at 9:30 this morning.
That's a quick turnaround then. So that's what we like to see. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's been very helpful to understand from your perspective. The council's put forward some suggested changes anyway. Mr. Russell, you stated that you thought that if it was going to be helpful, I think it would be helpful to have your suggested wording. So it would, if you could provide that to us, then myself and my colleague can just have a look at that. Obviously, sort of moving forward, subject to us reaching main modification stage, then everybody will have an opportunity to consider the actual wording of any modifications, and they will be appropriately consulted on publicly for anybody to comment on as necessary. Could you therefore also, as you're looking at this anyway, or you're proposing a suggested change, could you also look at the issue that Mr. Drover has raised? Because it's that term, make up the provision for the community. So are you talking about if there's an existing deficiency, it's not up to the development to make up that existing deficiency? Strategic infrastructure is slightly different in that, yes, we know that there are deficiency or capacity issues in relation to some strategic infrastructure, but that's a planned growth district-wide issue. It's not a specific issue. And I know that's not what you mean the policy to say, because I think, Mr. Russell, you have made that clear, but I will look at the wording and of it and my colleague, but if you can just look at the wording, if you're still content that wording, no, it's perfectly acceptable, please, again, just leave it, and myself and my colleague will have a look at it. But if you think actually we could do with changing that slightly if it's giving the wrong impression, okay, if you can have a look at that. So thank you. I'm just going to check in my notes just to make sure there's nothing else. Okay. Anything further on CP6? No. Okay, it's 11:15. It's slightly earlier than I would have normally do for a break, but I think we've had quite a good session on CP6. So I suggest that we have a break now, come back at 11, and then we can go through the matter 11C, which is on other infrastructure. So be back here at 11 o'clock, please. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. If we can return, please make a start. Thank you. Now, the first, looking at our MIQs, the first policy that we've included there about looking at ensuring that all necessary infrastructure will be delivered, etc. I'm not proposing to have another discussion about that. We've had that partial discussion as part of CP6. We've had it as part of other previous sessions, and we will be having that discussion as part of site allocation policy discussions. So I'm not proposing to have to keep that conversation going at this point. So I would like, subject to there being nobody who wants to say anything further, I would like to move on to the other policies that are relevant to this section on other infrastructure, starting with delivery policy DHC5. Okay. Now, policy requiring health impact assessments, that's become quite normal. I haven't got an issue with that. Can I just confirm, does the council have guidance, or does the county council or other local authorities within the region have guidance on the production of a HIA, particularly for this locality, or is it just the general guidance that's utilised?
So just to confirm, it'll be my colleague Conrad Moore who'll be covering this policy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Russell. Mr. Moore?
Thank you. Essentially, at the present moment, it's the broader guidance which I refer to in my MIQs.
You do, yeah.
But there was an intention that at some point the county council would produce additional guidance once the system was more established, if there were particular issues that came up.
Okay. Okay, thank you. What's the, other than producing HIAs and requiring that for strategic allocation sites, and the policy also refers to major development proposals should have had regard to, and there's a list of requirements. And the start of the policy refers to design aspects to encourage healthier lifestyles and sustainable neighbourhoods, and adverse aspects will need to be mitigated. I'm trying to understand, again, it's the case of, aren't these aspects covered by other policies anyway? So could the council explain why they consider it so, and obviously it's covered in national policy, so is this a repetition of national policy? Could the council just explain their approach and the reasoning behind having this as a separate specific policy and what it's trying to achieve, please?
Yes, essentially it does follow on from the MPPF elements, but I think the key part is in the supporting text, which essentially says that the health impact assessment should outline how development could positively or negatively impact on the wider determinants of health and should identify actions to enhance the positive impacts and mitigate the negative impacts. So it's a way of identifying these are the issues in this locality with this major development or strategic allocation, and how that can either positively improve the site or mitigate any adverse impacts. And it's having that recognition of what are the impacts from that. It was a good process that we went through with the county council, that as the plan was developed, they actually did health impact assessments of the plan and the policies, and that was submitted as part of the county council feedback through the planning process. And that enabled us to enhance some of our policies or amend some of our policies in order to tackle any adverse or indeed enhance any positive impacts.
So is it really all about the HIA and what that says? So in terms of requirements?
Yes, it's identifying what are the impacts arising from this project or plan, and how those factors have been taken into account.
So is there a particular reason why then specific elements are highlighted? And I say highlighted because major development proposals only need to have regard to. They don't need to, it's not a must, it's not a should. It's they have to have regard to, and you've got the 3 elements.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand, why have those elements been picked out? Has that come out of the consultation, the decision as to why certain aspects have been put in there?
Elements were taken from other examples in the country, like at East Cambridgeshire, and we had a workshop session held by the county council, which identified those elements. And also we had a very good talk with Worcestershire County on their early work on the health impacts, and all those factors led to the selection of those specific criteria.
How are they consistent with the policies, the other policies within the plan, the other relevant policies? Because obviously you've got an allotments policy, you've got a
I believe
you've got
access.
You've got sustainable accessibility policies, because you're talking about, sustainable transport provision, whether that's active or public transport. But yours is specifically to local healthcare facilities. Well, what about to schools? What about to shops? What about to employment? What about to? There's lots of. I'm just trying to understand, why have those elements been picked, and why are they highlighted in the policy?
As I said, it was working with the other councils and those with the policies already in place when we were developing this plan. And those were considered particular to what the lead commissioner on public health in Gloucestershire County wanted to see.
So what you're saying is these are specific to the area?
Yes.
Is that what you mean? Okay. And the requirement that they should have, that development proposal should have regard to these aspects then? how does that meet the requirements? Would they automatically be included in a HIA anyway?
They would be in an HIA, yes.
Does the supporting text need to highlight why these areas are, because reading the supporting text, it doesn't explain why these particular areas have been put into the policy and not other aspects. So is there, and it's a question, it's not I'm not telling you to do it, but from the council's perspective, is there a need to just explain, because obviously the text that supports the policy is supposed to explain the policy. So is it necessary to, from the council's perspective, to just explain why those areas are of particular concern? Or do you feel no, because the HIA process would cover all that anyway?
I feel that the HIA process would cover that anyway. As I say, those criteria did result from discussions with the League Commissioner on Public Health. And I think paragraph 480 covers that aspect.
It does, but 480 is more about the co-location of health facilities. And obviously you've got accessible and changing places, toilets, provision, etc. At key strategic community locations, which is the last point. It's not in the three elements that are highlighted. It just seems odd to me that those have been highlighted when there are other aspects of a HIA. So I'm trying to understand the reasoning behind it. You're saying it was highlighted by the lead commissioner.
Yes. In discussions with the lead commissioner at the county,
yes, at the county level. But there isn't any explanation in the supporting text as to why food production, allotments, community orchards has been highlighted as a particular, should have regard to this. Major development proposals as part of a HIA, in producing a HIA, will look at a plethora of details. So why these three elements?
It was at the time that originally it was proposed that we would just have access to healthy, fresh and locally produced food. But then what was coming out of the other work, such as the ethos work on the open spaces, was a requirement also for the needs of providing that opportunity. So allotments and community orchards were considered an essential part of that, of which we have numerous examples of those throughout the district. Cam, for example, has a community orchard, as does Wootton Town have community orchards. There are also, as I said, lots of allotments, and that was a feeling that that we picked up, that in Gloucestershire those elements are. So
if it's a particular characteristic of the area, let's call it that, I just think there needs to be some form of, I know it's having regard to, so it's not a must, and and nobody's going to say that would need to necessarily change, because the HIA will pick that up, and that element of flexibility is necessary, because this may not be relevant to all major development proposals. All major development proposals will need to produce, or proposals on strategic allocation sites will need to produce a HIA. So, so not all major development proposals will be strategic allocation sites. So you're only, so they won't need to produce a HIA. So those that fall under the strategic allocation sites don't need to do a HIA, but they will need to have regard to the 3 aspects that are there. Is there anything missing from that? Is that exactly what the council is trying to achieve?
Yes.
If that's what you definitely want to achieve.
That's what we would like to achieve, yes.
Okay. I think, okay, I'll have a look at that. I'm just wondering whether, I'm not necessarily, I don't necessarily think that anything needs to necessarily change in the policy, but I'm just wondering whether some supportive text to actually just explain that, because it's not explained in the explanatory text.
Okay.
May assist, but leave that one with me, and because I don't want you to doing sort of abortive work or anything.
Okay.
I will come back to you and let you know on that point. Okay, but thank you for explaining that. That's made it much much clearer to me as exactly what the council is trying to achieve on that. I'll come back to you on that. I'll do that through a later session or through communication through the programme officer.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments from anybody on DHC5? No, I've got no hands up. Okay. Let me just write a note down that I do this action. Okay, thank you. Let's now then move on to delivery policy DES2. So I'm just going along through the MIQs. So we're looking at green infrastructure. Now, obviously, I note the evidence. There's various types of evidence that have been provided relating to and identifying existing and projected needs for green infrastructure. It's been linked with open space and a GI green infrastructure study, and that set out some key recommendations that obviously has informed this policy. Now, I do have some specific questions on the wording of the policy. In terms of the council's approach to GI, green infrastructure, could the council just summarise its approach in relation to this policy? Again, what it's trying to achieve, and then I will just see if there's anybody else who's got any queries from a more of a general and then I will come to my specific queries in relation to the actual wording. So come to council first, just to give me an understanding of where this policy is coming from.
The policy has come from the requirements in the National Planning Policy Framework, but also there was a gap identified in the last local plan, that there is no specific policy linking the benefits of GI. It sort of sat in a collection of different policies, and there was a need to focus. So in response to comments from Natural England, from the Local Nature Partnership, and a number of others, that we devised a specific green infrastructure policy to address those issues. So that was very much the driver, and it was further a key element. That gap was taken on in the work that Ethos, the consultants, did more than just an open space study. They built in the green infrastructure elements as part of that. And there was a lot of, we felt, information that needed to be drawn together in order to address the green infrastructure issue effectively and with robust evidence. So they undertook the work. It's all in our evidence base, and the executive summary of all that work also identified key recommendations and actions, and hence the policy was put together.
Can I just confirm how the council sees green infrastructure in relation to open space in terms of the definitions that are set out within the framework? Because there's an element of crossover, isn't there?
Yes, there is an element of crossover. And indeed, some of our communities now and sports clubs are identifying that they can provide the multiplicity on their sites. So instead of regimes of cutting the grass to death effectively, that they can encourage elements of a sporting site, for example, outdoor sports site, to be left wild, part of the rewilding, and offer those benefits in addition to just an active sports field. So it's linking those elements and providing wider benefits to our communities.
I mean, why I've asked that is because you've got obviously separate policies, which is absolutely very normal in local plan documents. So not an issue with that at all. It's we'll come on to it when we come to deal with open space, because obviously open space in particular is referenced in the framework in relation to its protection and the way that the policy, national policy, deals with open space. And I will come on to that when we come to open space. But obviously if part of open space is green infrastructure, then, and there is a crossover, then it may also be relevant to this policy. But we'll discuss it when we come to open space, your open space policy in a bit more detail, I think. Okay. I'm just looking at the consistency of the wording with national policy. That's all. Okay. That's all. So thank you for that. Now the policy refers to green infrastructure, but it also refers to strategic green infrastructure. So is there a difference? Is there a specific reason? Because it's not referenced, or I couldn't see the reference to the difference between green infrastructure and then it's the final paragraph in your policy which refers specifically to strategic green infrastructure, and it does that twice. So I'm trying to understand, but there's no, or I couldn't see a reference to it, and please highlight it to me if it is in the supporting text, the difference.
Essentially, the strategic nature is the wider links with areas, key corridors through the district. So, for example, the River Severn is of a strategic cross-boundary scale and allows the movement of wildlife as a corridor, and the green infrastructure doesn't just stop at the boundary. And we have the the green infrastructure plans that the LMP have produced across the county and are in the process of updating, because that guidance was 2015, and that indicates key movement corridors or key GI corridors for the movement of people to have access to the countryside and the wider surrounds. So I think this was just to pick up, it's not just necessarily a local, immediate locality issue.
It goes beyond the boundary. Is that what you're talking about? And
it's keeping that functionality of those wider links.
Which is absolutely laudable and is something that all councils should be aiming for. Absolutely. I just want to understand, because the policy says identified strategic green infrastructure assets. So you talked about there's document that, is that the one that sets out these identified strategic green infrastructure assets?
The cluster maps at the back of that work identifies the strategic corridors, and also it fits with the work that's ongoing, as I mentioned in the MIQs, with the aspects like the nature recovery strategy, because it is these opportunities for stepping stones or movement corridors, as well as all the other links that can benefit people, such as the footpath networks and such like.
So does the policy almost have separate processes then? So I'm just trying to understand exactly, because you've got where a loss or negative impact on green infrastructure, functionality or ecological system, etc., is done, then mitigation measures and or replacement green infrastructure will be provided. But then the final paragraph only relates to strategic green infrastructure. So it's this demonstrable harm, etc. So you've got two different processes.
Yes, and they've
is that explained? Is that explained in the supporting text?
Excuse me while I just refer to the document text.
I can't see it, but please tell me if I've got
that.
Well,
it's 684.
684, yes.
Refers to the Green Infrastructure County-wide strategy in 2015.
Okay.
There is an update that will be undertaken shortly, working with the local nature partnership on those frameworks, and there's a subgroup working on that at the moment. But that will be across the county. It's not just individual parts of the district.
I do think that there needs to be some form of explanation so that it's crystal clear to decision makers as to what a strategic green infrastructure is, and it needs to be identified, because that's what the policy says, an identified strategic green infrastructure. Is it where is it identified? Is it identified on the policies map? Because ideally that's where it should be identified, because that would give geographical, it would show geographically the intent of the policy. There's an argument then that all green infrastructures should then be placed on there, or there needs to be specific reference made to where the information can be found. And I recognise that can be updated. But that, again, that's not necessarily an issue, because you can say that all subsequent documents or subsequent updates to evidence.
We would have no objection.
Would that cause? I was just going to say, would that cause an issue for the council?
I don't think so.
Because it's just explaining exactly what the policy, I'm thinking of it from a decision maker and also from a developer's perspective. if it's very clear where the GI is, or the strategic GI in particular, obviously, yes, you've got the other element relating to GI, then it's very clear as to, and just that little bit of explanation, I think, may assist that. Okay, I'll leave that one with the council to come up with, and it could just be one sentence, a small, or just tweaking of some wording. I'm not asking for anything. It could be just something in 6.84, I think.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I said I'd come to it under open space, but I suppose it would be useful to at least open the conversation now. Is the policy consistent with national policy, particularly, I think it's paragraph, bear with me, is it 99? Yes, paragraph 99, which states that existing open space should not be built on unless. So this is this element of obviously if GI could form open space, the definition in the framework is very wide, although the framework has a separate definition for green infrastructure. How has the council sort of considered that in relation to the specific requirements in relation to open space, or do you consider that it's not that the policy isn't inconsistent?
I don't think the policy is inconsistent. It was certainly thought about as we were drafting the policy and how it may link with the open space policies that follow.
Okay, well, let's come on to it when we come to the open space policy, because we may need to just look at that in a little bit more detail. So I just wanted to understand from the council's perspective whether you considered it may be an issue. Now I'm just going to have a look at the regulation 19 comments that were made. Now the National Trust made a comment about the identification or wanting to see the policy or the accompanying text to be a bit more specific about the identification of replacement green infrastructure and what mitigation measures means, what that would be required to do. Now, obviously, the council, as part of the Regulation 19, gave a response and said that you don't consider that there's that anything further needs to be added. I mean, obviously, Mr. Funnell, do you want to come in on this? Do you want to explain what your particular concerns are? Because I don't want to put words into your mouth. Because you've not said that necessarily it needs to be in the policy, but something in the supporting text, perhaps. Could you just explain why you think that's necessary from either an effectiveness or justification reason?
Yeah, I think I think our concern perhaps is that there is obviously a huge amount of housing development needed in the district, and we just want to ensure the level of ambition of green infrastructure provision and enhancement is commensurate with that. Obviously, some of the strategic sites will have green infrastructure on site, but I think there are also a lot of countryside sites in the Cotswolds that people will be drawn to, some managed by the National Trust. And there will be increased recreational pressures on those sites. And it's just ensuring that there is a mechanism by which there isn't a gap left between on-site provision of green infrastructure on one hand and the nature conservation mitigation strategies for the SACs on the other. There's that kind of gap in between where there could be increased recreational pressures on countryside sites. And it's just, we might not necessarily want to change to the policy DES2, but it's just seeing a clear mechanism in there from that policy and from the strategic site allocation policies, maybe to the infrastructure delivery plan. And you know, for our own purposes, we've flagged the Stroud Landscape project as a green infrastructure project, and it's just being able to see through the policy or the accompanying text that there is that pathway as to how green infrastructure in the district can be grown and enhanced parallel to the increase in housing development, if that makes sense.
So your concern is you recognise that the strategic site allocations, for instance, will be delivering green infrastructure on site, but what you're concerned about is what's happening off site. What's happening in terms of that will create more pressure, or there will be more routes into the adjacent countryside areas, and how and what measures. So I'm trying to understand what you're asking for in terms of measures. Measures for what? Is it contributions? Is it
I think it's
to grow that GI outside of specific strategic sites? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think, just to give an example, I mean, the on-site green infrastructure provision at the strategic sites, it may be great for a week, you know, a dog walk during the week, but in the weekend, you know, there's a huge increase in housing in the Gloucester Fringe, for example, and people will be drawn to sites like Haresfield Beacon, Topograph Viewpoint, which are just a few kilometres away. There'll be pressure on visitor infrastructure like car parks and paths, potentially pressure on habitats, admittedly maybe not of the SAC, you know, in that league, but still important priority habitats. And it's just a case of ensuring that there isn't a gap, that there is that increased pressure and there is nothing to try and address that, or you know, provide for alternative provision or enhancement outside of those strategic sites. And it's just, yeah, seeing a clear mechanism either in this policy or the accompanying text, or it could be specific strategic site policies, you know, that a pathway for those concerns to be addressed, really.
Thank you. Council, to respond on that?
Yes, basically, the recreational pressure aspects are sort of covered quite significantly in terms of our habitats regulation assessment work and the mitigation strategies that accompany them. That is about relieving the impacts on the SACs, SPAs, and cover a broad catchment area. Now, within those catchment areas, we do say as part of the mitigation that alternative sites to act as relief points or provide alternatives to the public can be provided as part of that mitigation work. So that's where we were coming from in terms of that there are already the mechanisms within the district furthermore, we do have the policy ES6, which identifies, which is the biodiversity, geodiversity, which I provide safeguards and the requirement to mitigate impacts as well. So I do feel that the matter has been addressed, and there isn't a potential of a gap when the plan is read as a whole.
So are you saying that the existing policies in the plan would ensure that in dealing with particularly the larger sites, whether strategic or slightly under the strategic banner, they would need to consider this anyway?
Yes.
It's a requirement. So therefore, if mitigation is, if it's found that, yes, because of the distance to this, let's call it a destination sort of GI, isn't it? I suppose, really, rather than a local GI, so more strategic form of GI, that they may be required as part of their developer contributions to provide for any forms of mitigation for that. Okay. Mr. Funnell, does that give you an element of comfort, or are you still concerned that it's not referenced in, particularly in relation to the green infrastructure policy?
I think, yeah, I acknowledge the whole plan has to be read. The plan has to be read as a whole. I think we're also encouraged about the new the county-wide strategy update for green infrastructure that will take place. I suppose just to make a specific point, because I'm not able to attend the hearing on the Gloucestershire Fringe at the end of May. I think my reading of the policies for those strategic site allocations in that location, and I haven't, this was a long time ago that I read them, but it was, I was imagining that it was going to be entirely focused on on-site green infrastructure delivery. So yeah, it's just that point of whether either through those specific site policies or through this policy that there just needs to be a clearer mechanism for growing the green infrastructure in the district as a whole, commensurate with the housing. So yeah, I acknowledge the point, and you know, we don't want to press it further, but it's just bearing in mind that contributions might be needed for more than just on-site green infrastructure provision.
Thank you. Can sorry, I know we're sort of can you just highlight to me in the IDP, because if contributions are required towards other forms of GI, for instance, that are off-site potentially, has that been highlighted as part of the IDP? Can council
yes.
just confirm that?
Yes, ma'am. Alex Horton here on behalf of Stroud.
Thank you.
So it's covered within the IDP addendum. So section 2.3.
Let me just go to that just to make sure. Sorry, because I've got it up.
That's
so
in the addendum version.
Yeah,
so
I've got the addendum version up. 2.3. Yeah.
We
Okay.
cover a couple of key policy developments. So there's,
I knew I'd seen it. I just couldn't quite remember where it was.
So there's biodiversity net gain.
Yeah.
And there's the work that the County Council and the Local Nature Partnership are doing to establish the Gloucestershire Nature and Climate Fund. So that's to deal with biodiversity net gain requirements that potentially could be off-site. So there's a hook in the IDP around potential contributions there. And then also we go on to talk about the recreation mitigation strategies that Conrad's already mentioned for the SACs and SPAs in relation to the HRA requirements. And we've done some calculations based on what those strategic site allocations could potentially contribute towards those off-site mitigations. Obviously, what Conrad has also mentioned is that the principle first is to provide the recreational space on site first, and then we would seek contributions if that couldn't be provided on site, and that would apply across smaller scale allocations as well where it couldn't be provided off site. So I think there are a couple of measures there where we would be delivering new green infrastructure to help mitigate that recreational pressure created by the new development.
Is there, so again, Mr. Funnell, just coming back to your comments, are you only talking about designated sites, or are you talking more wider when you're talking about the expansion of GI? Because obviously the, and please tell me if I'm wrong, Mr. Horton, the IDP refers to mitigation on designated sites. Am I correct on that?
That is correct in terms of the mitigation strategies that have been produced, but there are obviously the broader principles around the nature recovery networks which are being developed by the council, and then also the climate fund which would apply to sites outside of so even if there isn't a HRA requirement to provide the recreation mitigation, that would apply to other sites in those areas as well. So even if you're outside of those the HRA sort of zones that have been identified, the zones of influence, there would still be a requirement to obviously meet biodiversity net gain and the green infrastructure requirements of the policies.
So you said that the hooks are in the sorry, I can hear somebody talking.
Sorry,
I'm not sure who. It's a little bit distracting. I've lost my train of thought now. So you're saying there's a hook in the IDP. Is there a hook in the policies in the plan? Not necessarily this one, just any. Because obviously you've got the biodiversity policies, the environment policies, which you've already been through. But is it there? And you can take me to one of the policies if you like, just so that I'm clear. So it doesn't, I'm just trying to decide whether a hook needs to be put in to the GI policy.
So I think, and Conrad, correct me if I'm wrong, because I know this is your policy, but I think it's paragraph 6.84 of the local plan talks about the nature recovery network, and suggests that could be an option. Don't know whether there are any further references, Conrad, that you might want to bring up.
Yeah, ES6.
I know we've got ES6. Let me just, point me to the bit in the policy, the hook.
It says development proposals shall provide a minimum 10% net gain in biodiversity through enhancement and creation of ecological networks within and connecting with those beyond the district by, and then there are measures set out.
I know, but that's about connecting with. It's not about additional recreational pressure on sites outside, is it? That's about connecting with those sites. So is there something else in the policy? I don't want to spend too much. I'm sorry, no, that's fine. I don't want to spend too much time on this.
The development should not adversely affect local ecological or green infrastructure networks is in there.
Where does it? Can you just point me to that?
That is bullet points just above the last paragraph of ES6.
Right, should not adversely affect. Okay.
There's also the last paragraph of policy DES2, which sets out that development that's demonstrably demonstrably harmful to identified strategic green infrastructure asset, etc., will not be permitted.
It will not be permitted, but if you're, I think Mr. Funnell's point is, you're allowing more people to live in the area, therefore there's going to be more people, more pressure, because those people at weekends or whenever will access the areas that he's referring to. Therefore, how can you ensure that any degradation that is formed by those people, potentially, erosion or whatever, you know, so the maintenance of footpaths, etc., the maintenance of habitats, how can contributions assist with ensuring that that is mitigated? I think that's the point that's being made. It's not just about that actually, well, we're not going to allow this strategic site to actually be developed because it's going to impact on that strategic GI. That's not what the plan's aiming to do. It's not going to be stopping development. So, and you're not going to be stopping people from traveling to those areas because you can't. So
I think
that's what this demonstrably being harmful to identified strategic green infrastructure is, stopping any development on those sites. But how does it ensure that pressure from the planned growth doesn't adversely impact
I think
those sites?
Within policy DES2, you've got criterion 3 and 4, which all relate to existing and enhanced green infrastructure and linking with recreational opportunities. And that sits within DES2.
So is there a hook back from DES2 then to the IDP in relation to developer contributions?
There is specifically in relation to the SACs and SPAs, and then in the, sorry, if I just turn back to the original IDP, there is a hook in there. If I just dig out the section.
I don't think, well, I'd just say one. I don't think we're going to actually dig the drill into the part of the three. Going to 10% we're targeting.
So there are identified potential contributions through the standards that have been applied within the original IDP. So that includes Natural England's led standards on things like accessible natural green space. So there's a hook in there for potential costs or contributions towards that, and that sits alongside the designated sites contributions as well.
Yeah.
And the implications for viability for developers from that, has that been suitably considered, or would that be on a case by case basis as the development comes forward?
Yes, so the costs for open space across the board in terms of sort of sport and recreation space, the special sites contributions for recreation mitigation, and then also the accessible green space standards that have been applied in the IDP are all fed into the infrastructure statement, sorry, the viability assessment I'll just see if I can find the relevant.
So how?
So,
sorry,
so
I know I'm sort of. I'm so
7.2.
sorry. I know I'm labouring the point, but I'm just trying to understand, and I do want to move on because obviously we've still got to get some of the stuff done before lunch. How will the council or a developer know that they need to provide a contribution towards a particular destination sort of recreational area that's not a designated site, so it's not an SAC or any other form of designation, but it's still an important recreational facility or area that's publicly, so it's a public area, obviously, publicly available or has public value, which is what the open space definition is. How will a decision maker or at the council, the decision maker, developers, local residents ensure that they understand which sites should be contributing to that? What's that, or will all sites need to consider that because of the distances involved in the district? Then you know, a recreational facility that's provided, you know, to the west, a site allocation that's provided to the west in the borough, will they have to consider any mitigation to these sort of destination areas in the east? How will that be determined for a decision maker?
I'd expect that would be identified through the consultation process on the planning applications. But again, Conrad, feel free to jump in.
So it's going to be very much on a case-by-case basis.
It would be on a case-by-case basis. And as I say, we do have the mitigation strategies whose catchment areas cover significant portions of the district. And of course, we have to meet the tests for any section 106.
Yes, absolutely. That's my...
So that's
the issue,
key.
Isn't it? Yeah.
And we would always look to fully accord with those tests.
Okay.
But it would be a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you.
And I would take advice from all relevant teams like Rights of Way at County, like our health and well-being people as well, all feed in to reaching a position on an application.
Would you consult National Trust, for instance? Obviously on the application you would, but if you were dealing with, because anybody can obviously be consulted on an application or can respond on an application, I should say, coming forward. I'm using National Trust as an example here because obviously Mr. Funnell's in the meeting. So if concerns were raised as part of the consultation process or as part of that discussion, then that would be in the mix. Then that would be considered. It wouldn't necessarily, and then it would be up to the council to decide whether that's appropriate or not.
Yes, I mean, essentially it would be the interests with the National Trust come from, for example, Robborough, Minchinhampton Common, from the Cotswold Beach Woods, and those catchment areas are much wider than that. And the mitigation strategies provide the hooks by which we would enhance. But as to the amounts, we already know the amounts because they were costed as part of the production of the mitigation strategy.
Okay.
And looks at the total growth within that catchment. And we already do work closely with the National Trust, as I say, on Robborough. The Cotswold Beach Woods was produced in conjunction with working with the National Trust as well. And we do have good links with them in order to secure the GI or improve recreation opportunities as part of the mitigation for that.
So from just to try and bring this to a conclusion now, so that I can just fully understand where the council's coming from. Council, you consider that the plan provides enough hooks at the moment, that no changes need to be made?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Funnell, are there any other comments you want to make?
I think we do very much welcome the mitigation strategies, Wadber Common and the new one for Cotswold Beechwoods. I think it's just the point about the cumulative effect of all the housing development on sites that aren't in those European designated sites, and having, whether it's a hook or a strong link between policy DES and the accompanying text and the infrastructure delivery plan. So I won't labour it. I think that's just the point where we're making, but we do acknowledge, you know, all the good work that's happened so far on green infrastructure and the mitigation strategies.
No, thank you for your contribution. Leave that with me. I will be looking at that I'm not going to ask the council to make any changes at this point, but it's something that I will have a look at. And I think it's something I need to just mull over and look at the policy and what the policies are saying in a little bit more detail. Okay, and that's so thank you for highlighting that concern. Thank you. Let me just go through any other points that have been raised. Oh, Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust has raised an issue of a correction of some wording, if that's necessary, if it's just a correction of it's in relation to the Nature Recovery Network, that it's maintained and updated by Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, not the LMP.
We would be happy with a modification.
But you can change that, but it would be it's an additional modification.
Yes.
It's never a minor modification, but yes, you can do that because it's a
factual update.
It's a factual correction. Yes, absolutely. So by all means, put that in your AM list. Thank you. Don't think there's anything else on that policy. So if we can move to the next policy, please, which is DHC6. Now, let me just bring that policy up so I can have a look at it. Okay. Now, the way that this policy is set out very much follows and appears to be consistent with national policy in the way that it is set out, which is why I just wanted to ensure that the GI was the same. It was because of the potential crossover. But again, I'll have a look at that, having listened to what I've heard today. So I've got no further queries on this policy in particular. I did note that it wasn't in relation to this matter, but it was another matter. And my apologies, but on my notes, I've not noted down whose rep it was. So my apologies. You may be present in the room. I think yes, you might actually be present because it's to do with Hardwick. There's a note in a Matter 3 rep which refers to a designation of local green space that's in existing neighbourhood plan in Hardwick. And all I wanted to do was ensure, obviously, local green space is specifically set out in national policy. I know that this local plan is not setting out local green space, it's not proposing that at all. It's very much sticking to the open space element. Local green space designation is very much a very high bar to cross. All I wanted to do was just confirm in the context of that. I just wanted to confirm whether that is correct in relation to the representation that had been made, and whether the local green space designations in the Hardwick Neighbourhood Plan 2017, whether that was in the context of the framework's definition of local green space, because some plans include local green space, but it's in lower letters rather than, that's just what they're called. It's not necessarily in relation to the definition that's set out in national policy. And why I'm asking that is there a need, if that is the case, although I obviously understand that neighbourhood plans form part of the development plan, is there a need to refer to local green space in whatever context, whether it's just something in the supporting text, and please tell me if it's already in there or not. I couldn't see it, but might be. Whether there needs to be a reference in the plan, or whether you're content, no, it's covered in several neighbourhood plans, it's absolutely fine. So just council response on that.
I believe that it's covered in the NDPs and does not need reflecting in the local plan itself.
Okay.
The two are read together. They're part of the development plan.
They are, absolutely. It's whether there was anything necessary to be in the in this plan, but you're saying no, you don't see that it's necessary to refer to that. Okay. Anybody else have any comments they wish to say on DHC6? Before we move on to DHC7. Okay, let's move on to DHC7, because there's a number of comments.
Sorry, Mum, there is a hand.
Oh, there. sorry, Ms. Fortune.
Sorry, thank you, Mum. I suppose it's just to go back to clarify your comment in terms of the comment that we made in respect of matter 3 about the local green spaces, which are defined in the Hardwick neighbourhood plan. I suppose it's really just from our point of view, it's really just I suppose it's just to sort of confirm that and making sure that the policies in the local plan effectively allow us to sort of retain, enhance or re-provide those spaces within our illustrative master plan. There's a few areas which are defined, which, I mean, our proposals for the site actually do significantly enhance them. So it's just ensuring that really that sort of that's noted. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
I knew it was bound to happen. Is that something to be considered more under the site allocation policy, where we can?
Yeah, I mean,
so there may need to be maybe something in that policy rather than under a generic.
Yes, I mean, I haven't got G1 in front of me, but there is reference to the Hardwick neighbourhood plan within our specific strategic site allocation anyway. So yes, we can talk about it.
We can, yeah. Session. Okay, that would be good. Yeah, are you going to be present at the? Yeah.
At the Gloucester Fringe session, yes.
Yes. Brilliant. Okay. I'll make a note to come back to that, but please remind me on the day.
Yeah,
if
will do.
Or my colleague, whichever one of us will be doing that session. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Let's have a look at DHC7 because it has raised a number of concerns from representatives. Particularly in relation to it being inconsistent with the framework. So issues have been raised that also that some of the typologies used overlap. Issues again about how the policy is going to be delivered. Is it through SIL? Is it through Section 106 planning obligations? So therefore, how does a decision maker or a developer know which way it's going to be delivered? Can I just get the council to explain the approach that, again, just to summarise the approach that you've got for the provision of new open space and why you've gone down the approach of standards and what the wording of the policy is trying to achieve in relation to these standards. The standards form part of the policy, which is not always the case in local plans. Can you just explain in summary, the council's approach, please? Is that going to be Mr. Moore, or is it?
Yes, sorry about the delay there. I was
okay.
still on mute.
That's fine. Don't worry, Mr. Moore.
Basically, the approach was taken from the open space green infrastructure sport and recreation study work, and clearly there were recommendations as part of that work, and the standards resulted from those recommendations being made. Now, also, in terms of delivery, the main report, part 1 of 2, on the open space and green infrastructure study shows how the council will seek to deliver the additional new open space, and there are processes both to guide the decision maker but also to help the developers select what amounts are required and the mechanisms for delivering the open space.
I'm just looking at the recommendations now. Are they consistent with the approach set out in the framework? Or is the approach set out in the policy consistent?
I believe they are.
How will the policy be used? Because the policy, whilst the policy sets out standards, what exactly will be expected from development? So you've got standards here saying, you know, allotments. So you've got the quantity standard, and it's not, obviously open space provision is and studies are not just about quantity, it's all about quality as well. You've got the access standards and you've got the quantity standards set out. But what are you asking developers to provide then for each of these different forms of open space? And then where there is overlap, so if there is children's play space and youth play space and it's on a parks and recreation ground, or it's on, or it forms part of a community orchard, or community orchard forms part of that, how's that going to work with the approach that you've used?
as I stated before, the main report sets out in section 8 the decision-making processes, and there are a series of flow charts on how we would basically the decision-making process on site provision of open space or off-site contributions, and those, as I put in the MOQs, are set out in figures 31 and 32.
Which I'm looking at, yes.
So those will lead to what the requirements would be. One's unallocated sites and one is for allocated sites. So, and then we have, as part of the proposals, the access standard, the quantity standard that would be expected, and that's done in a fairly typical way in the country of per thousand population and the space required. A useful element to also look at, although not part of the decision, and I'm just turning to it, is as to the importance of the open space areas, is a figure on, and it's a useful start line, is table 20 on page 122, which shows whether there's an excess of supply in an area for the different types, the typologies of the open space. So, and it highlights where there are shortfalls. Now, new development does not, under the strict test, would not have to make up that shortfall. That's the strict tests for section 106. But if the development was involving the loss of the open space, there is an indication that there isn't an excess of supply. So it makes any loss that much more material to the decision maker.
Are there any comments? Any other comments that anybody wants to add to this? Well, I'm just checking my notes. Well, this, oh, I've got a, Mr. Millard.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that isn't clear is whether the total quantum of open space provision that's going to be sought is effectively a calculation or the total sum of each of those component parts. But as you mentioned in the kind of introduction to this question, you could have an orchard in a parks and recreation ground, for example. You could have a joint play space. I'm wondering, is the council's starting point always going to be the total quantum of those quantity standards set out in the policy? But how does that take into account shared provision or shared typologies that come from one particular source of open space provision? And how is that allowed for in the overall contribution sought, particularly if it's off-site as well?
How's the response?
Basically, it's quite clear in the wording of the policy. It says provision should be made on site where possible and linked well with any existing green infrastructure features in the local area and the wider green infrastructure net. Where the achievement of these standards is unrealistic or inappropriate within the boundaries of the development site, a financial contribution will be secured through a legal agreement or community infrastructure levy in lieu of on-site provision. Where new provision is made, appropriate measures will be sought to ensure the future satisfactory maintenance and management of the open space or facility. There's also a point of note, the final paragraph, and it says where application of the standards would deliver a significant surplus in the local area, requirements could be varied in agreement with the developer to provide another form of open space to help address any deficiency in the existing provision. So there is flexibility.
But if we just go to that final point, does that final point meet the statutory tests?
I believe so, because we would have to take account of the statutory tests. Is it reasonably related? Is it?
If you're, I suppose it's if there's
it is an agreement.
If you're talking about a surplus of something in an area, obviously you are looking in terms of the development, you're looking at what the development needs. It's almost irrespective of what's in the area. You look at what the development needs are first, aren't you? Don't you? Then you look at what's in the provision, and then if you start talking about, well, the developer can provide something else. It's that hook to ensure that it meets the tests, isn't it? Because if there's a deficiency in existing provision on something else, but it's not related to the development, then it's not necessary, is it?
But it would be listed within the typologies that we have, and we have those the table 20, which shows where there are deficiencies or excess. It's giving a degree of flexibility.
I'm just trying to understand. Which, you know, I'm all for flexibility, because that actually helps in policies. It gives the council leeway to ensure that in terms of what's required, you know, you don't necessarily want it to be totally restrictive. That's not necessarily very helpful, and it often isn't very helpful to developers trying to bring forward development and who want to provide the community facilities that they want to. And if a policy is too restrictive, then they may not be able to do that. So absolutely agree with the flexibility argument. I'm just trying to understand whether the policy wording is consistent with what the framework says in relation to the provision of new open space. And whether the standards being set out in the policy is actually helpful. Just as a part along with that, obviously these standards are based on an assessment that has been made. Are they likely to change, or are these standards set for the plan period?
I believe that these standards would be set for the plan period. There would have to be a new review of the open space requirements carried out with any future review of the local plan.
Yes, obviously, yeah. Let me just look at the reps that were made. because there is quite a significant concern about it. I mean, you've got Sport England objecting. They don't normally object to many things. Or if they do, it's normally for particular reasons, but they object to the use of standards for new sports provision. They're stating that it's contrary to the framework. Obviously, they reference a previous framework because of the, obviously it's changed.
If it's any help, we have an annual meeting with all the sporting bodies and Sports England, and the matter has not come up in any of those discussions that we had, that there continues to be an issue.
Thank you for that. Does there need to be some clarity as to what would be expected to be provided as part of SIL or as part of Section 106? You know, the larger items, such as, you know, an indoor swimming pool or whatever, may be provided within a site, but it has a much wider catchment area, doesn't it? It's not just about that site provision. Playing fields may be just for the site. They will be of benefit for other members of the local community because they can come and use them as well, but they are specifically being provided for that site. But if there is a requirement for swimming pool or large, you know, sporting facilities that isn't just related to that site, does there need to be something set out? I know you referenced that you know, it will be secured through either it's be through a legal agreement or through SIL when you're talking about a financial contribution. If something is being provided on, I'm just trying to understand what this policy is trying to achieve, because the provision of new open space is an important community asset, and it's ensuring that it's, and the policy does say proportionate to the scale of development, so the policy does quite rightly say that, but it may be proportionate. So the policy says it needs to be proportionate to the scale of development, but then you've got all of the standards set out. So how then is that going to be utilised to ensure that everything required is proportionate? Is that clear within the policy? That's what I'm going to bring. I've got a couple of hands up, so I'll give the council a chance to have a think about that one, because I do want to move on to the next. We've got one more policy to go through, and then we will be finishing. Mr. Clements, and then I'll come to Mr. Millard.
Thank you, ma'am. I was hesitating because we didn't actually raise any comments in our submission statement in respect of DHC7, but I've just looked back to what we said at Reg 19 stage, and it's following on from your point, I think, and it's perhaps just by way of illustrating the problem with this. We use the example of indoor swimming pools, and the requirement presumably for a 106 contribution towards the provision of such, and the policy sets out 9.75 square meters per 1,000 persons. So if you just work that through using average household size in the district to generate contributions for a 25-meter swimming pool, which one assumes would be what would be provided, that's a 30,800 person increase in population, which would be more than all of the houses being planned for within the district. So it's sort of it's useful to illustrate the problem with how the policy might be implemented. And then if I'm sitting there acting on behalf of Crest Nicholson, let's say, and we get to our Section 106 contribution discussions in respect of the Huntsgrove extension, and the council is asking me for a contribution towards a public swimming pool, I will be saying, well, where is that project? And how is that project going to be provided for within Stroud District, mindful of R122 in the SIL regulations and the tests. And there won't be a project or a plan because there won't be sufficient contributions arising from development within the district to fund such. So I will push back against that. I think justifiably so. So it seems to me that there's a problem with the way the policy is constructed, and that illustrates the problem. I'm not suggesting a solution necessarily. I think we maybe said this sort of stuff ought to be put into SIL and not set out as a 106 requirement within a policy such as DHC7.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clements. That's been very helpful. I'll come to Mr. Millard, and then I will come to Mr. Horton, who obviously will talk on behalf of the council.
Thank you. I was going to make a point on SIL, but I think Mr. Clements has kind of more than adequately
stolen your thunder.
Yeah, somewhat. So it's fine. My only other point really related to the final paragraph of the policy in terms of addressing a deficiency. I just failed to see how there can be a test that's satisfied that would allow that to be a sound approach.
Yes, well, I've raised concerns about the final paragraph because I don't understand that and how that could meet. I know the council is saying it could meet the tests, but I'm still not convinced or persuaded that how it would meet the tests. So if the council wants to try and convince me otherwise, that would be helpful. Mr. Horton, if you want to come in first.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Just on the point around off-site contributions, I think it's worth flagging that both the open space and green infrastructure study and then the playing pitch strategy do identify sports projects within the district. So I think what we would be seeking, again, without putting words into Conrad and Mark's mouth, but what we'd be seeking is contributions towards those projects, utilising the standards that we have there, and then also utilising the Sport England national standards, which are applied across a number of districts across the country in respect of the costs. So that's it's called the Active Places Power contribution calculator, which is available on the Sport England's website. So that helps to calculate the figures that are in the IDP for costs associated with it, and then obviously utilising the standards. But yeah, we'd expect that to be contributing towards identified projects in order to meet the tests of Section 106.
Thank you. And yes, I've obviously had a look at the other. I know we're focusing on the open space and GI document, but I've obviously looked at the other documents that are in the evidence base. If specific, and you said that specific projects have been identified or specific requirements have been identified, then the approach is the approach of the council then to amend the projects that are set out in the SIL to include those and to deliver those projects through SIL. And if so, rather than through Section 106, and if so, does that need to be clearly set out, whether it's in the policy or whether it's in the supporting text, just to make it absolutely clear as to how these aspects are going to be brought in and the contributions that would be expected and how that would be calculated, having heard from Mr. Clements saying, well, if you use the standard that's set out and how it doesn't make sense to me from what I'm hearing.
If I can just come in generally, as in terms of the last session, we talked about not keeping it flexible in terms of planning contributions or SIL within the overall context of CP6 and infrastructure. So we would not seek to be specific about any particular form of infrastructure in terms of SIL or 106 in any other policy, because that would be contradictory to our general approach. I do understand the point that's being made around contribution. I think the specific issue around swimming pools. I think Mr. Horton's addressed the point about having an up-to-date IDP with a set of policy, strategic projects, which contributions can be appropriate contributions can be are made towards. But I don't believe that we need to. I think there's reference in the supporting text to further guidance, supplementary planning guidance on how contributions will be, or how that process will essentially work in terms of that flow diagram that Conrad Moore mentioned earlier. So I think if we can address that specific issue in the identifying how a calculation is to be made, and in terms of the population, the expected population of a development, and then how that relates to a list of live strategic projects relating to those particular uses, and if it doesn't, the fact that then there would need to be it would need to reflect the particular tests in terms of the planning obligations, then I think that would clarify the matter. I don't personally think we need to set a working example in the policy supporting text at this stage.
So if that's how, because I'm trying to, it's all well and good having standards, but it's not clear to me. So are you saying that actually you don't need to have the standards in a policy? They can be sat elsewhere, and what you need in the policy, or you've already got the existing policies, is about that new open space will be necessary. Absolutely, totally agree with that. Whether it's sort of green open space or whether it's built facilities, needs to be provided if it's necessary, and it's been evidenced in your different studies. What would the policy look like? So, for instance, if we decided that this policy is not doesn't work, it's not effective, it doesn't tell the decision maker or the developer what is required from developers, what issues would that cause for the council, if any, if we were to say that this needed to be amended?
Well, I think it would be very significant to the council. We've carried out a very comprehensive open space GI built facilities study in accordance with para 98 of the framework. We've identified deficiencies and surpluses in the area, and and local standards have been derived based upon that assessment, and I feel that's entirely in accordance with the MPPF. We've set out what those standards are, so there's, in terms of clarity, the standards are set out in the policy, and we've said in the supporting text that we will develop a supplementary planning document to demonstrate how the policy will be applied. So I'm kind of struggling to see what else we can do. Taking the standards out introduces an element of doubt as to what standards we'd apply. We can't put into the policy all of the mechanisms and worked examples that you would expect normally in a supplementary planning document. So I'm kind of struggling to see what the issue is essentially here.
I'm still not clear as to what will be expected from development.
So let's go through it. So a new development is going to take place. We have these standards. You calculate the number of people that will be living on that estate. You then proportionately apply those standards to the scale of the development, as it says in the first paragraph, and that identifies the amount of the relevant open space that will be required to meet the needs of those people living on the development. You would then assume that for most development, certainly for the case of children's play areas, youth play space, etc., that quantity of development would be designed into the layout. And if development cannot, if the development cannot accommodate all of the impacts essentially arising from recreation needs of the people who would be living on the estate, then contributions would be required towards the relevant aspects. I understand the point that's been made about, which was made previously, about if there's if you have an open space and it has multi-use within it. So I think we can take away that particular issue, and that, again, I think that's something that could be clarified through supplementary planning document, and the way then that any contributions required from the development would be applied to off-site projects would be clarified through the infrastructure delivery plan, as Alex Horton has said. So the alternative is we don't have policies, we don't have standards in the plan, and how would we ensure, how would we be able to demonstrate that the developments are meeting the recreation needs of the people who will be living on site?
Are there any other comments that anybody wants to raise on this policy? Ms. Flanagan?
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, just listen to Mr. Russell's explanation. I think one of the challenges of the policy is it assumes a one size fits all. And I think with some of the sites you'll have natural features or topography whereby there'll be a degree where some sites can conform with the standards for some of the typologies quite well. And it might be that the natural features actually mean that there's an over provision for certain typologies of space. And then it might be harder to accommodate some of the typologies. I just wonder whether in practice has the policy got the flexibility for that kind of balancing to be done, that you might be over in one typology, but you're slightly on a different typology because of the natural features on the site, and whether it's fair for that to be reflected in the policy.
Thank you. I think the point is, I know that the policy says where the achievement of these standards is unrealistic or inappropriate. So that may be an instance where it may be inappropriate because it's already there, for instance, within the boundaries of the development site. You don't say that it doesn't need to be, it therefore doesn't need to be provided, or flexible approach will be provided. You say, well, we'll ask for a financial contribution so that it can be provided off-site, but it may be that it doesn't actually need to be provided because of the scale of the proposal, etc. Because this relates to all residential development, so you're talking from one house upwards, aren't you? So
that's correct. Yes, I mean, it's intended to meet the tests in the sense that there will be demands arising from the development, and therefore,
oh, absolutely,
there needs to be
a
proportionate contribution. It kind of, yeah, and
but you're saying proportionate contribution in one hand, but then you're saying you've got very specific standards, and I'm not saying at this point these standards need to come out. It was just a what if at this stage. I'm not saying that, you know, standards can, this has obviously been an assessment, and the needs assessment absolutely makes it very clear as to what is required, and that is an important part of the evidence base for the local plan. It's what the policy says that's important, and what the policy is trying to do, and that which is informed by the evidence base. So it's informed by, and quite rightly, you know, standards can't be outside of the plan. If there are going to be standards, then they need to be in the plan, and they need to be in some form. You've got standards in relation to vehicle and cycle parking. They're in an appendix, but they still form part of the plan. They're not in a policy, although reference is made to them in policies. We had that discussion yesterday. So I'm just trying to understand the amount of flexibility that's around. And this is not a, you know, developers will try to get out of providing this. The vast majority of developers actually want to provide this because it makes their development really attractive to people for marketing purposes, etc. People will not want to go and live on a site if they've got children, then there isn't a play area going to be provided or green infrastructure going to be provided, etc. So absolutely, you know, it's critical that new open space provision is provided in the most appropriate way. I'm just not convinced by the wording that's set out in the policy that this is going to achieve, or it's clear and effective in the way that it's written. That's what I'm struggling with, not with what the council is trying to achieve. Haven't got an issue with what the council is trying to achieve. It's just whether the policy wording actually is effective. Does it meet the key tests? That's what I'm struggling with. And we'll come back to the final sentence, because I am going to move on, because I am going to finish this session before we have lunch. So brace yourselves. We've got another one to go. Yeah, another policy. I'm still not convinced by the final sentence and how that meets the statutory tests. So I don't know if there's another way you can explain what you're trying to achieve through that. I know you tried to explain it earlier, but it's this where the application of the standards would deliver a significant surplus. Again, what's significant surplus? How will that be determined in the local area? Requirements could be varied. So that gives an element of flexibility there, in agreement with the developer. So again, you're in agreement to provide another foot, but you're not reducing the requirement then to get rid of the surplus. You're saying you could provide another form of open space to help address a deficiency in the existing provision. So it's got nothing to do with the development then. That's the way I'm reading that, which is a different way than obviously you, from what you're telling me, that's not what you're trying to achieve, or is it?
I mean, there's an interplay between the two standards for one issue. So you might have a surplus in quantum terms, but you may not address the access, the accessibility standard. So that we need flexibility there to ensure that that we achieve both. So it may be that actually an alternative provision that addresses the accessibility of open space, but doesn't lead to a quantum in terms of what the standards would require, may be a way forward. I understand what you're saying. I don't want to. I mean, if it's a case of deleting this paragraph, then that's fine. I mean, if you feel that is not in conformity with the tests, then that's something that we will accept. It's not intended to be. We are certainly not intending to go over and beyond standards for open space in terms of impact. It's simply to add a certain amount of flexibility. I mean, Mr. Flanagan talked about site features. It may be that, you know, that there will be a circumstance where site features or location would require us to be more flexible in terms of the open space that we seek. The other point is obviously we explicitly stated it's in agreement with the developer. So if the developer is not in agreement with that point, taking your point about the attractiveness of open space in terms of marketing a site, it may well be that, and certainly in terms of case development management cases where a policy team has been asked for a comment on the application of standards, we've certainly, in some cases, we've said, well, strict adherence to the standards would require X, but in this case, because of site circumstances and because of the way that the development links in with existing open space in the area, you know, we're happy with the provision that's being provided. So we've certainly been flexible in development management cases. But if, as I say, if that paragraph causes you problems in terms of adherence to the tests, then we're happy for that to be either amended or deleted as appropriate.
Okay. Leave that with me. Thank you. Is there anything else on this policy, DHC7? I'm going to take away what I've heard on that, and then if we require the council to have a look at the wording of that policy, we will tell them at a future hearing session. Okay, thank you. Let's move on then to the final policy that we're going to be considering this morning, which is EI11. And this is on providing sport, leisure, recreation and cultural facilities. Now, let's just have a look. Now, you'll be pleased to hear that I'm not going to labour this one quite so much. Well, maybe I will. Who knows? Let's see how it goes, shall we? There are specific elements in here. So obviously the policy is requiring specific new sports, cultural, leisure and recreational facilities. So there is a definite crossover with the open space policy that we've just gone through in quite significant detail. So again, why is it necessary to duplicate? I know that this provides leisure, recreation and cultural facilities, so it goes beyond just open space. So I suppose the starting point is what is, or if the council can just explain the purpose of the policy and why the council feels it doesn't duplicate or unnecessarily duplicate other policies that are set out in the plan.
This policy was taken from the recommendations, again, from the open space, green infrastructure, sport and recreations, and we had protection of open space, we had provision of with the standards. So it was felt that there was a need to have a policy on providing the sport, leisure and recreation and cultural facilities. And as part of that, we set out the criteria, factors that we would consider as part of that additional new provision.
Is this all covered in other policies though?
Sorry, if I could just jump in here. Let's give an example. Let's say a bowls club wish to put in a planning application for a new facility. Now that's not protection of open space. That's not required as a to enhance or mitigate an existing housing development. That is a standalone proposal for a bowls club. So essentially this policy is around what tests would you apply to those kinds of developments as they come forward. Thank you.
But in terms of the other, why is it necessary to have a specific policy for that when you've got other development management policies? Or
well, we don't have any other development management policies for specific
you don't have for
leisure facilities.
Okay. Let me just see which policy I'm thinking of. Okay. I suppose it's why is there reference to the cycle and vehicle parking standards, because that's already got a separate policy anyway. So you've said before that the entire plan needs to be read as a whole anyway, whatever form of development comes forward, so that a developer will know and a decision maker will know which policies are relevant. Adequate access to and between the facilities will be provided for people with disabilities. So a particular one has been highlighted there. You've got biodiversity interest. Well, that's covered by another policy. You've got adequate walking and bus, cycle and links. Again, that's covered by another policy. I'm just trying to understand why have you got another policy that is already set out by others? Why is it so important, or how effective is this? Because when you start to, the issue is consistency between the policies, because then you've got to ensure absolutely there is consistency. Duplication is not necessary, and it does start to get, it can, if you're not careful, it can start to get messy, because it's trying to ensure that the policies within the plan are effective. And if all you're doing is duplicating what's already there. Now, if you're saying that you will support and you wish to support the provision of sports facilities, cultural facilities, those facilities that aren't covered in the other policies, that's literally what the policy needs to say, I suppose, in accordance with the other policies in the plan. So it literally is as simple as that. So I'm just trying to, are these elements consistent with what's been said in the other policies? And I know you're going to say yes, they are. I'm not convinced, and I would need to look at them side by side to see whether they are consistent. But again, is it unnecessary duplication? I think it possibly is, because I don't quite understand why it needs to be referenced again about parking and again about access and sustainable transport when you've got policies on that.
So there's a limited range of land uses. We've got housing policies, we've got employment, we've got retail, and we feel that we need a corresponding policy to deal with, essentially. And it's not like we have a policy on sporting facilities and a separate one on cultural facilities, and a separate one on. We tried to.
We won't go down the route of the number of policies, because that would be an improvement issue I have with this plan, which I'm not here to consider. And I have dealt with plans with numerous policies and rolled my eyes at that. But I'm not here to improve the plan. I'm here to look at soundness. So I'm purely looking at the policy from a soundness perspective. And I don't have an issue with the council having a policy wanting to ensure that it's made perfectly clear in policy terms that the council wishes to support the provision of these additional cultural leisure facilities, whatever that may be, as long as it's made clear within the supporting text what that refers to, why it's separate to the other policies in relation to sports provision and any open space provision, because you've got recreation in here, but obviously you're talking about facilities rather than actual open space. But then you can have built facilities as part of sporting and open space. So I just think some clarity needs to be provided, just for me to understand what it is that the council is trying to achieve through this policy, and that it's absolutely crystal clear. And I absolutely support the council wanting to encourage or wanting to support cultural facilities. I'm not convinced that there's nothing in the supporting text that really explains what this is talking about, really. It's very generic. Are there particular examples or requirements that the council wants to ensure comes forward, for instance, in terms of any cultural facilities or recreational facilities that aren't currently in the district? I think that's what I'm struggling with as to its purpose, because you've already got the generic policies. And I know that some of your other policies are in separate chapters. Again, I wasn't going to raise this. Because it can be argued it's an improvement element, and I don't have an issue with policies being, because for instance, the policies that we've just gone to are in different chapters. Some are in the environment chapter, some are in the housing chapter, some are in the economy and infrastructure chapter. So let's just say it wouldn't be the way I would do it, but but I'm not here to improve the plan. I'm here to look at the soundness. What I suppose the issues are that you've made it very specific for some policies only to relate to residential. They could quite easily relate to some other, or aspects of them could relate to other forms of development, for instance, industry, or could relate to facilities outside of, such as these sport, recreation, leisure facilities, looking at character and appearance, etc. Amenities of the area. Not quite sure what amenities of the area means. So some clarity on that might be useful. This is the way that you've produced the plan, and that's absolutely fine. But there is an awful lot of duplication. So I've let a lot of the duplication go, because you've explained why you've got that duplication. So I'm trying to understand this one. Why does this one need duplication? And how is it effective in that way?
So the council would like a policy to cover standalone sport, leisure, cultural facilities that are to be developed in the district. And I'm sure if you speak to a lot of planning agents, they would say, yes, it is helpful to, if they're representing clients, to have a specific policy that says, yes, the district council welcomes the provision of additional cultural leisure facilities in the plan. If we don't have that policy, we'll essentially have no clarity on what the council's view is on the provision of standalone facilities of that kind. You will then have planning agents hunting around trying to find relevant parts of other policies that may be applicable, parking standards, impact on biodiversity, etc. But again, maybe I'm a bit old school on this, but I feel it's helpful to have in one place a policy that identifies the sort of requirements for a particular land use. We've done that elsewhere. It would be a bit strange, given that we do it for other land uses in other parts of the plan, to not cover this important aspect of provision in the district. If you feel that there is unnecessary duplication, which addresses soundness issues in terms of the individual 5 criteria, then obviously the council will be, provided those criteria are addressed elsewhere in the plan, then obviously we would be happy to accept a modification. I think the criteria 1 is important because those facilities are part of the spatial strategy. So we specifically refer to, obviously the site allocation policies have their own specific requirements, as you've said, but in terms of the existing settlement hierarchy and ensuring that facilities are well placed in terms of where people mostly concentrate, where the need is, and we also reference specific rural needs, because we need to be flexible to accept that not all facilities can be or should be grouped within the settlement hierarchy.
You'll be pleased to hear that I don't have an issue with criterion 1. I think that's a a very good way of stating where, in terms of location, what you would like to deliver.
So I don't want to labour the session. So if we had an amendment which essentially retained the first paragraph and criteria 1, then that subject to all of those other issues being addressed elsewhere in the plan. I think access and disability to buildings is important. So I think that I would like 5 to be, if an amendment were to be made, I would like 5 to be specifically referenced there. The other aspects, yes, there is an attempt to gather together in one place to be helpful to a developer as a checklist of the kind of issues that we would like to be addressed. But as I say, I'm not aware of significant objections to this policy from the development industry. I appreciate that your role is wider than that, but we feel that this is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. That has been helpful. I suppose what I need to know is whether the elements are consistent. So it would be helpful for me, I'm not going to do it now, but if I can ask the council to look at the precise wording of the criteria, forgetting criterion 1, because that's not duplicated elsewhere, and looking at criterion 5, but I understand your remit there of wanting to keep that element in, because it can be very specific to the provision of facilities. Although then you can argue that actually, does building regulations cover that? So are you covering building regulations? Because that would be a requirement. If I can ask the council to just check against the other policy wording and just ensure that it is consistent, and come back through the programme officer with that if there are any amendments that you think actually we could do with tweaking this wording, because, and then that gives me some comfort that at least the elements are consistent, and I'll take on board the council's view that actually having everything in one place is useful to the council, but also to a developer potentially, and I'll take it on board what you've said. The numbering is wrong, so there is a numbering thing, but you can just change that anyway. I just have a couple of points that I just wanted to clarify. What does amenities of the area mean? What's that refer to? The development would not harm the character, appearance and amenities of the area.
The amenities there is the enjoyment of living somewhere. What is it? Is it the quietness? Is it?
So it's the living conditions.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't like the term amenity, because amenity means nothing. And us as inspectors don't use the term amenity, we use living conditions. Whether that's what you mean, whether it is living conditions or whether it's because obviously you've got people who are visitors, they experience different conditions when they come to an area. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I just wanted to just clarify. So I'm not saying that that needs to be changed, because it's not really an area doesn't have an amenity. A person has living conditions, and a person has, or a business, people within that business have conditions that they need to ensure that those conditions are adequate, such as, you know, lighting and, you know, green space, etc., etc. So I just wanted to just clarify what that meant. Okay. And just in relation to this, it's criterion 3 and partly 5, I suppose. It is, you want it, it's this, what is meant by adequate? So what's the benchmark for adequate? Because you use that word in both. So you want the development to be made readily accessible to adequate bus, cycling and walking links. Do you need the term adequate in there? Is that effective enough?
I think just in answering this, that what we're trying to avoid is locations where there is perhaps one bus that came once a day without a return trip, or, you know, and could offer people the ability to use that facility reasonably with the purpose. So if we were talking about a theatre, for example, would people be able to get there and use that facility without hanging around for long periods of time?
So do you need to make that explicit in the supporting text as to what you mean by adequate then? To just make it clear, excuse me. To just make it clear that, because it's like, what are the benchmarks? What is it that you want? Really, you want these facilities in a settlement location, so that people can easily access by public transport or by walking, by cycling. Absolutely, I applaud the council for trying to achieve that. Obviously,
yeah,
can you have a look at? Could you just have a look at that? I don't.
Yeah.
As long as it's explained what adequate means, I don't think you need to change the policy wording on that. It's just explain it, maybe a sentence or two in the supporting text, because there's very limited supporting text to the policy. So it might be helpful to a developer coming forward with a potential opportunity if they fully understand what that means. And obviously for 5 as well, adequate access to and between the facilities. Again, what does that mean? So maybe just a little bit of clarity on that. Okay, thank you. Mr. Fong.
Excuse me, ma'am. It would be rude of me not to comment on this policy, given that we are probably promoting the greenest stadium in the UK presently. But we do find having this policy bundled up into something which is a little bit more explicit helpful. And on behalf of our clients, even though the club has recently been relegated, we do feel that the stadium will grow, and indeed the sporting provisions around that stadium will grow. And to have something like this is extremely useful. And indeed, over the past iterations of our application, has been useful to know that this has been coming down the traps. That said, I do have a little bit of discomfort with criterion 2, because you can't really make an omelette without breaking eggs, and it is a subjective criterion. I'm not even going to try and reword it for you, but you can see that if you stick up a stadium, there will be some, and there had been some, that are going to say it's going to harm the character and amenity of the area.
Well,
So,
it is about material harm, isn't it?
yes. But then it goes down to the decision maker, and how does he reconcile material against subjective harm? So that's just a point of that I think needs a little bit of clarity. But the main point, Ma'am, is in terms of pushing sporting facilities through, this policy, in our opinion, is very helpful.
That's very useful. So thank you for that input, Mr. Fong. The wording for criterion 2. Could the council have a look at that? Because obviously I'm hearing what Mr. Fong is saying, and in terms of harm, it's usually material harm that's of significance. So does that need to be made explicit within the policy? Council thoughts?
My thought would be that the insertion of the word material before harm is appropriate.
Okay. Does anybody have any issues with that if that was taken forward? No. No. Okay. Well, it's a suggestion. So if the council can just have a look at, you're looking at the consistency of the wording. If you can change that to would not materially harm, and then I will look at myself and my colleague will look at the policy and see whether any other changes would need to be made. But I will take on board what Mr. Fong has said as well on that point. Thank you. It's the consistency element that's most important. Anything else that anybody wants to raise on matter 11 at this stage now? No, matter 11C, I should say. On that basis then, thank you very much, and thank you for bearing with me. I know we got into a little bit of detail on some of the policies, but that's the nature of the game, I'm afraid, and it will get even more so when we come down to the site allocations in more detail. We are back next Thursday, where we're finishing off, I think we're going back to matter 2. Which seems a long time ago now, but we're coming back to finish off that session. So thank you very much for your contributions. That's been really helpful. And I will see whoever is coming along to the 11th of May session next week. Oh, Mr. Russell. Oh, there was something I needed to add as well. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just mindful of the previous session. You stated you would consider the timescales for homework.
That's exactly. I've just got my note. Yes, because I know that in Wednesday's session when we were dealing with the new settlements and with the Gloucestershire County Council bringing in the rail evidence, that I would give a time frame as to when I wanted responses on that. Back on that. I would like a deadline of by 25th of May. If it can be provided sooner, great.
So just for clarification, that's all of the homework aspects that we've considered this week by the 25th of May.
Yes, which is it's just under 3 weeks, isn't it?
Yes. Obviously, we can get individual items to you earlier, like, for example, the next steps statement that we talked about.
The next steps, if that can be, I've given you a deadline of the 19th for that, so that's different. That is different. If you can provide other items as they come along, don't wait and think, well, we'll just provide it as one club. If you can do that, but obviously we will be preparing for the other. We've got quite a few sessions coming up after the 11th in particular. we've got 1 week following after the next. So we've got limited time to look at matters, and we do want to focus on the site allocations matters, because that's pretty critical in terms of the plan. So yes, I'll give a deadline of the 25th, which is our last sitting day. So I recognise that the council needs to fit that in, because obviously you'll be in, doing the hearing sessions as well as other persons. So, but hopefully you've got time to get that in by the 25th. Okay, is that okay for the deadline then?
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you very much then. Well, thank you for your contributions. It's been really helpful. Thank you. I'll finish now.